The night Silas Crow decided a woman had to die, he didn't hesitate. He sat behind a polished desk in his Billings office, fingers laced together like a man about to offer a loan, and told his men to intercept the stagecoach before it reached the Callahan land. Not to frighten her, not to warn her, to make certain she never arrived at all. He slid a sealed envelope across the desk, the driver's name, the route, the exact hour the coach would pass through Red Rock Pass, and said, "Leave nothing that can be traced back to me." One of the men asked about the woman. Silas looked at him the way a man looks at a slow child. "She's a mail-order bride from Ohio," he said. "Nobody out here knows her name yet. Nobody will miss her." He was wrong about that, but he wouldn't find out for weeks. If you've ever been dismissed as nobody passed over, underestimated, treated like you don't count, then you already know something about Marlowe Bennett. Stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and drop a comment with your city or country so I can see how far this tale has traveled. Because what happens to Marlowe is the kind of story that stays with you. The snow started before dawn. Not the soft cinematic kind that drifts down in lazy spirals and settles like powdered sugar on fence posts. This was Montana in January of 1887, and the snow came sideways, driven by a wind that had no patience for anything living. Bit through wool coats. It filled boot tracks within seconds. It turned familiar terrain into something indistinguishable and hostile. And anyone who spent real time on the frontier understood that weather like this didn't care who you were or what your plans had been. Wade Callahan knew this the way he knew his own name. He'd been ranching the Copper Basin land for 11 years, long enough to read the sky like other men read newspapers, and he'd known by mid-afternoon the day before that the storm would be bad. He should have waited it out. He told himself he would. Then one of his hands came in from the north pasture and said he'd counted the herd short by at least 40 head, and that the gate on the upper section had been found hanging open, which meant either someone had left it that way or someone had opened it deliberately. Wade didn't say much. He went to the barn, saddled his horse, and started north. He should not have taken Elsie. That was the part he replayed later, lying in the dark of his own bedroom with the ceiling sun pressing down on him. She had been standing in the kitchen doorway when he came through to get his coat, 5 years old and already watching him with those serious dark eyes she'd inherited from her mother. And she had said, without drama or pleading, "I want to come." He'd looked at her for a moment, thought about the empty house, and the fact that their nearest neighbor was 4 miles south, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Holt, had gone to town that morning and wasn't due back until the following day. He told himself it was only a quick ride. He told himself the storm wouldn't hit until nightfall. He helped her into her coat and her boots and lifted her up onto the saddle in front of him, and they rode out together into the white. The herd wasn't where he expected. He pushed further north than he'd intended, following tracks that kept getting swallowed by fresh snow almost as fast as he could read them. Elsie sat quiet against his chest, the way she always did when she could tell he was concentrating, which was one of the things about her that occasionally stopped him cold, that a 5-year-old could read a room or a landscape that well. Her mother had been like that. Claire had known when to talk and when to let silence do the work. And sometimes looking at Elsie was like looking at a photograph that hadn't finished developing yet. He didn't find the cattle. What he found instead was a line shack on the edge of a frozen creek, half collapsed on one side from the weight of a previous winter's ice load, the kind of structure that existed on the frontier more as a landmark than an actual shelter. He'd used it once or twice during branding season when the north pasture work ran long. He hadn't been inside in over a year. He pulled up about 30 yards out and studied it for a moment, not sure what had made him stop. The wind was loud enough to muffle almost everything, and his horse was shifting beneath him, unhappy with the cold and the footing. Then Elsie moved. She turned her head slightly, tilting it the way a person does when they're trying to isolate a sound, and said, "Papa." "What? Somebody's crying." He almost told her she was imagining it. The wind could produce sounds, had produced sounds, over the years that resembled voices, animals, things that weren't there. But Elsie wasn't a fanciful child. She didn't invent things. So he sat still and listened, really listened, and after a moment he heard it too. Not crying exactly. More like a sound a person makes when they've stopped having the strength to cry, but can't quite stop making noise. A thin, ragged sound that was nearly nothing. He handed Elsie the reins and told her to sit still, and he climbed down. The snow around the shack was undisturbed at first, but as he moved closer, he found a shape that didn't belong, a depression in the white, roughly the size of a person, just around the south side of the shack where the wind had partially built a drift against the wall. He knelt down without thinking and started brushing snow aside with his gloved hands, and what he uncovered was a woman. She was alive. Barely. She was wearing clothes that were entirely wrong for this country, a traveling dress layered over what looked like a second dress. both of them soaked through and stiff with ice, coat that would have been adequate in Ohio or Illinois or wherever she'd come from, but was doing almost nothing out here. Her face was the color of old tallow, lips cracked and dark, and the frost had gotten into her hair and turned it brittle. One of her hands was pressed against her side, and when Wade moved it, he found the fabric beneath dark and crusted. She'd been shot. He didn't waste time trying to understand it. He pulled off his outer coat and wrapped it around her, then picked her up. She was lighter than she should have been. He carried her back to his horse with his jaw set, and his mind already sorting through what needed to happen next. How far to the ranch? How long in this wind? Whether she'd make it that far? He got her up onto the horse and climbed up behind her, holding her against him to keep her from sliding, and told Elsie to hold on tight. Is she going to be okay? Elsie asked. I don't know, he said, because he didn't believe in lying to her about things that mattered. They rode south. She didn't wake up for 2 days. Wade got her back to the ranch and sent a hand for Doc Reardon in Harlan, which was 12 miles east and took most of the night in that weather. The doctor arrived in the small hours, half frozen himself, and spent 2 hours working on the wound while Wade sat in the kitchen and drank coffee he couldn't taste. When Reardon came out, he said the bullet had gone through cleanly, which was the one piece of luck in the whole situation, but that she'd lost blood and had significant exposure, and that the next 48 hours were going to tell the story. He left supplies and instructions and rode back to Harlan before sunup. Elsie refused to go to bed. She sat in the chair outside the guest room door, wrapped in a quilt, watching the door like it might do something. Wade told her twice to go to sleep, and she ignored him both times with the polite, absolute stubbornness she'd been displaying since approximately the age of 3. And eventually he gave up and sat down in the hallway beside her. They stayed like that for a while, not talking. Who is she? Elsie asked eventually. I don't know. She had a bag, Elsie said. I saw it in the snow before you picked her up. Did you get it? He hadn't. He went back out in the dark, retraced his path to where he'd found the woman, and dug around in the drift until he found a leather satchel, frozen solid and mostly buried. He brought it back. He didn't open it. It wasn't his to open. The woman's name, when she finally surfaced from whatever depth she'd gone down to, turned out to be Marlowe Bennett. She opened her eyes on the morning of the second day, looked at the ceiling for a long moment as if she was conducting an inventory, then turned her head and looked at Wade, who was sitting in the chair beside the bed where he'd moved it from the hallway after Elsie finally fell asleep. She looked at him the way a person looks at someone they recognize from a description, but have never actually seen, comparing the real thing to the image they'd built. Then she said, with a voice that had been damaged by the cold and came out rough and uneven, "You're Wade Callahan." He said yes. She closed her eyes again, and he could see something moving across her face, not quite relief, because relief would have been too simple. It was more complicated than that, like a person setting down something they'd been carrying for a very long time. I'm Marlowe, she said. I was supposed to come in December. He stared at her for a moment, not moving. Then the thing she'd said assembled itself properly in his mind, and he understood what he was looking at, who he was looking at. He'd started the correspondence back in September, after a winter alone with Elsie that had convinced him he couldn't manage the ranch and raise a child simultaneously, not on his own. He'd contacted a matrimonial service out of Chicago, not something he'd advertised, not something he was particularly proud of, but practical, which was the way he tried to approach most things. They'd sent him 3 letters of introduction from women interested in frontier life and honest situations. He'd written back to all 3. Only one had written back to him. They'd exchanged letters through October and November, building up a correspondence that was careful and honest, and occasionally surprising in its candor. She'd told him she was 27, the oldest of 4 children, that she'd been working as a schoolteacher in Columbus, and that her family's situation had changed significantly in the past year after her father's death, and that she was interested in a new beginning. He'd told her about the ranch, about Elsie, about the things he wasn't good at, which was a longer list than the things he was. They'd agreed she would come in December. She hadn't come in December. He'd waited. He'd sent a letter to the service asking if they'd had any word. Nothing came back. He'd told himself she'd changed her mind. People changed their minds. It happened. He looked at her lying in the bed, at the bruises along her jaw that the cold had preserved, at the careful way she was holding herself even in sleep because of the wound in her side, at the state of her hands, which had been frostbitten on the tips and which Reardon had treated, but which were still wrapped in clean linen, and something cold moved through him that had nothing to do with the weather. Someone attacked you, he said. Yes. On the trail. Red Rock Pass, she said. 4 men. They stopped the coach. She paused. They killed the driver. He waited. They took everything I was carrying. My trunk, my money, the letters from the service. She opened her eyes and looked at him directly. They were looking for something specific. They kept asking me about papers, documents. Her jaw tightened slightly. I didn't tell them anything. What documents? She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her deciding how much to say, how much to trust him. He supposed he understood that. She was in a stranger's house, in a stranger's bed, dependent on a man she'd only known through letters. Trust wasn't something she'd hand out without thinking about it. My father's estate, she said finally. He died last spring. He left me property, not money. He didn't have much money at the end, but land. A small parcel in this territory, actually. He'd acquired it years ago, never developed it. He left it to me in his will. She paused again. The documents proving that inheritance were in my bag when I left Columbus. And those are what the men were looking for. Yes. Wade sat with that for a moment. Did you have them on you? The documents? Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, she was too worn out for that, but something that suggested the capability of one. I'm not an idiot, she said. The documents, it turned out, were not in the frozen satchel he'd retrieved from the snowdrift. She told him this on the third day, when she could sit up for short periods and take broth and hold a real conversation. She had sewn the papers into the lining of her second dress, the one layered beneath the outer one, before she'd even left Columbus, because she'd known even then that traveling alone as a woman with legal documents was a risk she needed to manage. The men who'd ambushed the coach had gone through her bag and found nothing. They'd left her for dead in the snow. She'd managed to drag herself to the line shack, which she'd seen from the road earlier in the journey, and remembered, though she hadn't had the strength to make it inside. How long were you out there? Wade asked. I don't know exactly. 2 nights, I think. Maybe 3. She said this without drama, the way people describe things that have already happened and can't be changed. 3 nights in that. I had the coat. She'd glanced down at the borrowed nightgown she was wearing. It was a good coat. He did not tell her what her coat had looked like when he'd found her. Some things didn't need saying. What he was working through, what kept circling back as he moved through his days and tried to keep the ranch functioning, while also managing the situation he'd inherited, was the question of how those men had known. They'd known the route. They'd known the timing. The matrimonial service didn't publish information about clients. That was the whole arrangement. Discretion was built into the cost, but somehow 4 men with weapons had been waiting at exactly the right pass, on exactly the right day. That wasn't a coincidence, that was knowledge. He didn't say any of this to Marlowe yet. She was still healing. But he turned it over and over in his mind while he worked, and the conclusion he kept arriving at was an uncomfortable one. Someone close to him had known she was coming. Elsie found Marlowe on the 4th day. He hadn't planned to introduce them, yet he was still trying to figure out what the appropriate situation even looked like, given that everything had gone sideways from whatever plan he'd had. But he came in from the barn to find Elsie sitting on the floor beside the guest room bed with a book open on her lap, reading aloud in the painstaking way she'd been practicing, sounding out the words with her tongue between her teeth, and Marlowe propped up on the pillow, listening with an expression Wade had never seen on a woman's face before. Not pity, not condescension. Genuine attention. Like Elsie's reading mattered. He stood in the doorway and didn't say anything. Elsie got to the end of a page and looked up. She's a good listener, she informed Wade seriously. Marlowe caught his eye over the top of Elsie's head. That almost smile again. You taught school, Wade said. 6 years, Marlowe said. Did you like it? She considered this. I liked the children who were trying, she said. I didn't always like the parents. He understood that more than he probably should have, and surprised himself by almost laughing. The trouble started showing its edges on the 6th day. It came in the form of a visit from 2 of Wade's ranch hands, Pepper and a younger man named Galt, who knocked on the kitchen door in the afternoon and came in with their hats in their hands, in the manner of people who had something to say and weren't sure how to start. Wade poured them coffee and waited. Pepper was the senior hand, had been with Wade for 7 years, and had the weathered face and economical speech of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. He said, Town's talking about what? About the woman. Pepper turned his hat in his hands. People are saying she's a mail-order bride who made up an attack to get your sympathy, that she probably just missed the coach and walked into the snow on her own. He paused. Some are saying worse than that. Wade looked at him steadily. What kind of worse? Galt spoke up, which surprised Wade because Galt usually let Pepper do the talking, saying she might have come out here to get access to the Callahan land through marriage, that the whole attack story is invented. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. She had a bullet wound, Wade said. People are saying she could have gotten that before she came, Pepper said. Some kind of trouble in Ohio. Wade set down his coffee cup very carefully. He was not a man who threw things or raised his voice when he was angry. He'd learned young that that kind of anger mostly just scared people and solved nothing, but there was something in the specific shape of what Pepper was describing that made his jaw ache. She was half dead in the snow, he said. I found her myself. The wound was days old and untreated. Her hands were frostbitten. "I know that," Pepper said quietly. "I'm telling you what's being said. Not what I think. What do you think?" Pepper looked at him. "I think somebody wanted her not to get here. And I think whoever that is probably isn't thrilled she survived." That was the most Pepper had said on any one subject in recent memory. And the weight of it sat in the room after he finished speaking. The ranch hands weren't alone in their doubt. Over the following days, the atmosphere around the property shifted in ways Wade couldn't entirely see, but could feel the way you feel a change in pressure before the weather breaks. He'd hear conversation stop when he walked into the barn. He'd catch Galt watching the main house from across the yard, with an expression that wasn't exactly hostile, but wasn't comfortable either. Two of the seasonal hands he'd hired in October suddenly found reasons to leave, one claiming family illness and the other offering no explanation at all. He didn't push any of them. There was something under the surface of the situation that he hadn't fully mapped yet, and pushing before he understood, it felt like the wrong move. What he focused on instead was the question that kept coming back to him. How had those men known Marlowe's route and timing? He'd told 3 people she was coming. Mrs. Holt, who'd been with the property since before Claire died, and who he trusted without reservation. Pepper, because the senior hand needed to know there would be a new presence in the household and what that meant for the schedule. And Silas Crow, who had come by in late November to go over the winter accounts, and who Wade had mentioned it to almost passing. The way you mention an upcoming change to someone who's been helping you manage your affairs. Silas Crow had been managing Wade's business finances for 3 years. He was not a rancher himself. He was a businessman based in the county seat, Harlan, with interests in banking and land brokering, and several other concerns that Wade had never entirely mapped out. He'd come to Wade through a mutual acquaintance after Claire died, offering his services at a reasonable rate, and his work had been competent, and the accounts had always balanced. Wade didn't particularly like the man there. There was something about Silas that always felt like a performance, like he was standing slightly to the side of himself watching, to see how he was landing, but competence and likability were different qualities. He thought about Silas for a long time in the evenings after Elsie was asleep and Marlowe was resting. He thought about what it would mean if it was Silas, and what it would mean that he hadn't seen it coming, and whether the fact that he hadn't seen it coming meant he'd missed something obvious, or whether Silas was simply better at this than most people. He didn't arrive at a conclusion. He filed it away. Marlowe was on her feet by the end of the 2nd week, moving carefully and wincing when she moved wrong but upright, which the doctor said was faster than expected, and which Marlowe accepted as information, without appearing particularly pleased about it. She wasn't a person who seemed to take much satisfaction in her own resilience. She just worked with what she had. She helped in the kitchen because she said lying still made her feel useless, and because Mrs. Holt, who had returned from town and was attempting to manage her feelings about the situation with varying success, was perfectly willing to accept assistance. She read to Elsie in the evenings. She asked Wade questions about the ranch that were specific and practical, about the grazing rotation, about the water situation in dry summers, about what the upper sections were worth and what he intended to do with the timber on the north face, and the questions were the kind that a person asks when they're trying to understand something, not when they're performing interest. He answered them honestly. He didn't know what else to do. On a Wednesday morning, about 16 days after he'd found her, she came into the barn while he was mending a section of harness and said, without preamble, "I need to tell you something about the documents." He set down the harness. "The land my father left me," she said. "The parcel in this territory. I looked it up before I left Columbus. I wanted to understand what I had." She paused, and her voice was steady, but her hands weren't quite. He noticed she had her arms crossed, and her fingers were pressing into her own sleeves. "It borders your north section, about 40 acres. It runs along the same creek." He was quiet. "If we had married," she continued, "and if we had filed jointly, those 40 acres would have become part of this property. The way the original survey was drawn, my father's parcel actually fills in a gap in your northern boundary that currently leaves you without legal water rights to the upper creek access." She looked at him directly. "Do you know what that's worth?" He did know. He'd known about that gap in the boundary. For years it was an old survey problem. One of those things that accumulated in frontier land records where the original maps had been made fast and sloppily, and he knew that whoever owned that parcel controlled whether his cattle had access to the upper creek in dry summers. He'd tried to find out who held that land twice in the past 4 years, and both times had been told the ownership was unclear, tied up in an old estate, her father's estate. "So someone," he said slowly, "figured out that if they could get their hands on your documents or stop you from reaching here before we married, they could claim that land for themselves. Or Marlowe said they want both. My inheritance and your water rights." And the only way to get both is to control the outcome of what happens to me and to this ranch. He looked at her for a long moment. You've been working through this for a while. I had 2 weeks in bed, she said, with the dry edge of someone who has had to make peace with a situation before complaining about it. Do you know who it is? She shook her head. I know someone from this county arranged the ambush. The men who stopped the coach weren't from Ohio, they had the sound of this territory. And they knew details they could only have gotten from someone with access to your correspondence. She paused. Who knew I was coming? He told her. She listened without interrupting, and he watched her face as he got to Silas's name. She didn't react visibly, just kept listening. When he finished, she said, Tell me about Crow. He told her what he knew, which wasn't as much as he'd have liked. Silas Crow, land broker, money manager, man of Harlan, age somewhere in his 50s, unmarried, property interests that were difficult to fully trace because they moved to various business entities whose names changed periodically. Marlowe's expression, by the time he finished, was something he couldn't quite classify. Land interests that are difficult to trace, she said. Yes. Do you have records of the accounts he's managed for you? In the office, 3 years' worth. I'd like to look at them, she said, if you'll let me. He thought about it for about 3 seconds. All right, he said. What she found in the accounts over the following 4 days was not obvious. That was the first thing she said when she came to him with it, that it wasn't obvious, that it was the kind of thing you'd only find if you knew what you were looking for, and that it had probably been designed that way deliberately. She spread papers across the kitchen table after dinner, Elsie already in bed, and showed him. Small amounts, moved at intervals, through what appeared to be routine ranch expenses, feed costs, equipment repairs, a category labeled simply surveying fees that appeared twice a year but which, when she laid them out in sequence and compared them to the actual invoices in the file, didn't match. The numbers were close enough to look correct at a glance, but they didn't match. He's been siphoning, she said. Not enough to notice in any single month, but over 3 years it adds up to something significant. Wade looked at the numbers. He looked at them for a long time. I should have caught this, he said. You weren't looking for it, Marlowe said. You had no reason to look for it. That's how this works. He wasn't sure if that was meant to make him feel better, but it didn't particularly. He didn't say so. He was doing the calculation instead, working out what the amounts represented, and what they represented was a pattern not just theft, but preparation. Like someone building a stake to fund a larger move. He's planning something, Wade said. He's already started planning something, Marlowe said. The ambush was part of it. We got in the way. She paused and her voice shifted slightly still level, but with something underneath it that wasn't quite level. My brother Daniel is still in Columbus. I've written him twice since I got here and I haven't had a reply. Wade looked up from the papers. I'm not saying anything has happened, she said quickly. The mail is slow. There are reasons, but... She put her hand flat on the table on top of the accounts, like she was holding them down. But if Silas Crow has been watching this situation long enough to arrange an ambush on a specific road on a specific day, then he knows I have a brother. And he knows that Daniel is one way to get to me. She met his eyes. I need you to understand that I am not going to sit here and wait for that to develop. He understood. He'd been thinking something similar, though he'd been thinking it in terms of the ranch and Elsie rather than a brother in Columbus. The waiting felt wrong. Everything about the passive position felt wrong. What do you want to do? He asked. I want to understand exactly what we're dealing with before he decides to move again, she said. I want to know what land Silas Crow holds, or has positioned to hold, and how it connects to mine and yours. And I want documentation of everything he's taken from these accounts, witnessed and notarized. She paused. After that, I have some ideas, but I need to know the ground first. Outside, the wind picked up against the kitchen windows, the kind of sound that in this country meant weather coming. Wade listened to it for a moment and thought about the 40-acre parcel along the North Creek, and about a man who sat behind a polished desk and made decisions about what lives were worth. He thought about the driver of that stagecoach, who had a name he didn't know yet, and who had died in Red Rock Pass because he happened to be working that route on the wrong day. All right, he said. We start tomorrow. Marlowe looked at him across the kitchen table, with the papers between them and the wind outside, and the lamp throwing uneven light across her face, and nodded once. Not dramatically. Not like a woman in a story. Like a person who has decided what she's going to do and is now committed to doing it. It was, he thought, the most honest expression he'd seen on anyone's face in a long time. The next 2 weeks moved in 2 directions simultaneously. On the surface, the ranch functioned. Wade managed the herd. The hands did their work, Mrs. Holt kept the house, and Elsie went about the business of being 5 years old in winter, which involved a significant amount of time spent at the kitchen table with books, and a worrying amount of interest in whether she could teach the barn cat to sit on command. Kat was not cooperating, but Elsie had patience that exceeded most adults. Underneath, Wade and Marlowe worked. They worked carefully and quietly, because they had no way of knowing who else in Sons in the area might be reporting back to Silas, and because the moment their hand became visible, they lost the only advantage they had, which was that Silas still believed Marlowe was dead. She had checked the documents sewn into her dress lining. They were intact, slightly water-damaged at the edges but legible, which she'd said with a relief she almost didn't show. Those documents, the deed to her father's parcel, the probate records, the chain of title going back 30 years were the foundation of everything else. Without them, she had nothing. With them, she had standing. Wade wrote discreetly to a land attorney in Helena who had handled a boundary dispute for a neighboring rancher 2 years prior. He asked general questions, framed carefully, about what legal steps would be involved in consolidating 2 adjacent parcels through marriage, and whether existing boundary gaps in original surveys could be addressed through the territorial courts. The reply took 8 days and confirmed what Marlowe had told him. The parcel she'd inherited, if properly filed, would resolve the boundary issue entirely and give the Callahan ranch clear legal claim to the Upper Creek. More to the point, whoever held that parcel legally had significant leverage over the ranch's future. Enough leverage that a man with long-range ambitions might consider it worth a significant amount of trouble to acquire it. He also wrote to a business contact in Harlan asking, as casually as he could manage, whether anyone knew the current status of the Crow Land brokerage, specifically whether Silas had filed any new claims or purchase agreements in the past 6 months. That reply came back faster and was more interesting. 2 new claims, both in the northern part of the county, both bordering existing ranching properties. One of them butted up against the eastern edge of Wade's own north pasture. He didn't tell Marlowe immediately. He sat with it for a day, working through what it meant, and then told her over dinner with Elsie present, framed as a conversation about ranch geography, which Elsie accepted with the polite tolerance of a child who had learned that adults often talked about things that weren't interesting to her. After Elsie was in bed, Marlowe said he's building a position, 1 piece at a time. That's what it looks like. He's been doing it for years, probably. We just walked into the middle of it. Wade nodded. He won't wait much longer, Marlowe said. Once he knows I survived, and he'll find out eventually. These things travel, he'll move. He can't afford to let this go unresolved. She looked at the window. We need to be ready before that happens. How ready? Wade asked. She thought about it. Outside, the temperature had dropped again, and the cold pressed against the glass. Patient and enormous. The way this country was always patient and enormous, waiting for anything living to make a mistake. Ready enough. She said that when he moves, we've already decided what we're going to do. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Wade found it in the stack that Pepper brought in from the Harlan post office, mixed in between a seed catalog and an invoice from the feed supplier, and he almost missed it because the handwriting on the outside was small and careful and didn't announce itself. He turned it over and saw the return address, Columbus, Ohio, and felt something settle in his chest before he'd even broken the seal. He brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table without opening it, and went to find Marlowe, who was in the back room working through a second pass of the account ledgers she'd borrowed from the office, cross-referencing numbers against a handwritten list she'd made herself. She'd developed a system over the past 2 weeks that involved a lot of small notations in pencil that she'd explained to him once, and that he'd mostly followed. "Letter from Columbus," he said from the doorway. She looked up. Something moved across her face, not panic, but something adjacent to it, quickly controlled. She stood and came to the kitchen and sat down at the table and opened the envelope with her thumbnail and read without saying anything. For long enough that he went and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the stove, because he didn't know what else to do with himself while he waited. She set the letter down. "It's from my neighbor, Mrs. Aldrich," she said. "She's been checking on Daniel periodically. She says he's been gone for 2 weeks. His rooms are locked. The landlady hasn't seen him." She was quiet for a moment. "She says a man came around asking questions about me, about where I'd gone and whether I'd left anything behind." Wade set down his coffee cup. "She described him," Marlowe continued. Her voice was flat in the way that voices get when the person speaking is working very hard to keep them flat. Well-dressed, older. She said he had the manner of a man who was used to people answering his questions. "Did she give a name?" He didn't offer one. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire in the stove, and the particular silence of winter outside, which was not really silence at all, but a kind of deadened sound, the world muffled under cold. "Daniel could have gone somewhere on his own," Wade said carefully. "Work, a friend's place. He could have," Marlowe said. She folded the letter and smoothed it against the table with her palm. "Daniel is 22 years old and has never voluntarily disappeared from his rooms for 2 consecutive days without telling someone where he was going. He is not that kind of person." She paused. He is the kind of person who leaves notes, who sends postcards from the next town over because he thinks people worry. Wade understood then that they had moved into a different phase of the situation. He'd known it was coming, she'd said herself, weeks ago, that Daniel was one way to get to her, but knowing something is coming and standing in the middle of it are different experiences. We accelerate, he said. Yes, what do you need first? She thought about it for a moment. I need to know whether Silas has already found out I'm alive. If he has, the timeline changes. If he hasn't, we still have a window. She looked up at him. Who in this county talks to Silas regularly? He thought. The bank. He does business at the First Territorial in Harlan, the land office for filing claims. A couple of the larger operations, the Hargrove spread north of town, the mill on the river. He paused, and Doc Reardon. Marlowe's eyebrows moved slightly. Reardon plays cards with Silas every other Friday, Wade said. Has for years. It's not a secret. I don't think Reardon has any part in whatever Silas is doing. He's not that kind of man, but he talks the way sociable people talk, and Silas is the kind of man who listens. So Reardon knows I'm here. He came and treated you. He knows there's a woman at the Callahan ranch who was found in the snow with a bullet wound. Does he know who I am? I don't think I ever told him your full name, Wade said slowly, or where you came from. I was focused on the wound. Then we're still ahead, Marlowe said, but not by much. The next time Reardon sits down with Silas, depending on what gets said, the window closes. She stood up. Can you get me into the land office in Harlan without announcing it ahead of time? I go to Harlan every few weeks for supplies. It wouldn't look strange. Then we go this week. They went on Saturday, which was the day Wade typically made his supply run, which meant it wouldn't register as unusual to anyone watching the pattern of the ranch's activity. Marlowe wore clothes borrowed from Mrs. Holt, which fit him perfectly but were practical and didn't draw attention, and a hat pulled low against the cold. She'd been to Harlan once before, passing through on the stagecoach on her way west, and the town had made no particular impression on her then. Seeing it now, knowing what she knew, it looked different, smaller in some ways, more contained. The kind of place where everybody's business touched everybody else's, whether they wanted it to or not. The land office was a narrow building between the assay office and a hardware store, run by a clerk named Pudge Farrell, who had held the position for 15 years, and who greeted Wade with the comfortable familiarity of a man who knows the ranchers in his territory by name and cattle count. He gave Marlowe a curious look but didn't say anything, which was either professional discretion or the particular skill of a man who'd learned that frontier situations were often complicated. Wade asked to review the public record of recent claim filings in the Northern County area. This was entirely legal. Claim filings were public record, which was the whole point of them, and Farrell produced a ledger without hesitation and set them up at the side counter. Marlowe went through it while Wade made conversation with Farrell about the winter and the condition of the roads and whether the county planned to do anything about the bridge situation on the East Fork. She went through the ledger quickly but carefully, and what she found confirmed and extended what Wade had already learned from his contact. Silas Crow, or rather a business entity called the Territorial Land and Resource Company, had filed 4 new claims in the past 8 months. 3 were in the Northern County. One was described in language that was technical and dense, but which Marlowe read twice and then pointed to when Farrell's back was turned and showed Wade. It described a parcel bordering the North Creek drainage of the Callahan grazing allotment, which was as close as you could get to naming Wade's land without using his name. Wade looked at it for a long moment. He's already filed on adjacent land, he said quietly. Not a question. He's been preparing to surround you, Marlowe said, equally quiet. If he gets my father's parcel either through the documents or by simply preventing me from filing legitimate title, and he holds these adjacent claims, he controls your water access from 3 sides. What that meant practically was not complicated. A ranch without reliable water access in Montana was not a ranch for long. You could have the best land, the strongest herd, the most reliable hands, and without water you were finished within a few dry seasons. It was the oldest form of control in this territory, older than law, older than courts. You didn't need to threaten a man directly if you could simply wait for his cattle to die. Wade had been ranching long enough to understand this without having it explained. He planned this for a long time, Wade said. Years, Marlowe said. My father's estate was in probate for almost a year before I got clear title. Someone watching the territorial land records would have known that parcel was going to become available eventually, and would have been positioning themselves accordingly. And when the matrimonial service matched you to me, he saw the problem, Marlowe finished. If we married and I filed my father's deed properly, his entire position collapsed. The gap in your northern boundary gets closed, your water rights are secured, and suddenly the claims he's been quietly building around you lose most of their leverage. She closed the ledger and straightened up. So he decided to make sure the marriage never happened. Farrell came back to collect the ledger and they thanked him and left. On the street outside, the cold was sharp and thin, the kind that made breathing feel like a conscious effort. Wade unhitched the horses from the post, and they moved through town getting the supplies on the list, not talking about any of it, presenting the ordinary surface of a rancher and his companion doing ordinary Saturday business. It was only on the road home, with the town behind them, and nothing ahead but open land and the gray winter sky, that Marlowe said, "He has my brother. We don't know that. We don't know that he doesn't." She was looking straight ahead at the road. It fits the logic of what he's doing. He needs leverage. He's a man who thinks in leverage. "Daniel, the most obvious pressure point I have." Wade drove without answering, because there wasn't an answer that would help. The horses moved steadily through the cold, and the miles unrolled beneath the wheels, and he thought about a 5-year-old sitting outside a guest room door in a quilt, and a woman lying in a bed who had been left in the snow for dead, and about a man in a polished office who had decided that those lives were inconveniences to be managed. The anger that lived in him most of the time as something quiet and banked got a little hotter. "We'll write to the Columbus authorities," he said finally. "A missing person report, properly filed, with Daniel's full description and the details of the neighbor's account. That creates an official record. If something has happened to him, that record matters later. They won't act on it quickly, no. But it establishes that someone made an inquiry, that someone thought there was a reason to be concerned. That has value if this ends up in front of a court." He paused. "And it sends a message to anyone paying attention that we're not operating blind." Marlowe turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the road. "You've thought about this kind of thing before," she said. "I've dealt with a few situations over the years," he said. "Land disputes, mostly. The kind that start small and get bigger if you don't pay attention to what's happening underneath. Have any of them been like this?" He considered it honestly. "No," he said. "Not like this." The notary in Harlan was a woman named Agnes Purcell, which surprised Marlowe slightly, though she adjusted quickly. Agnes had held the position for 4 years, was precise and competent, and didn't make conversation she wasn't invited into, which were qualities Marlowe respected immediately. They went on a Tuesday, early before the office filled up with morning business. Wade had made an appointment the previous week, framed as a routine matter of documenting property holdings, which was true enough to not be a lie. Agnes set up her seal and her ledger and asked what they needed. What they needed was a witnessed and notarized affidavit documenting, in detail, the account discrepancies Marlowe had identified in the ranch ledgers, the amounts, the dates, the specific line items that didn't match their supporting documentation. They also needed the deed to Marlowe's father's parcel formally witnessed and entered into the notarial record, establishing clearly that Marlowe Bennett held legal title and had presented that title in Montana Territory in January of 1887. Agnes went through the documents with the thorough, unhurried attention of someone who understood that her job was to create records that would hold up under scrutiny, and she asked clarifying questions and requested to see the supporting documentation and made her own notes before applying the seal. When it was done, she looked at them both. "Is there anything else you need attested?" she said, with the precise neutrality of a woman who had learned to ask only what needed to be asked. "Not today," Marlowe said. They had copies made 3 sets and distributed them on the ride home in ways Wade had thought through. One set to the Helena attorney, carried by a writer he trusted. One set hidden inside the ranch house in a location he didn't tell anyone but Marlowe, and one set sewn back into the lining of Marlowe's second dress, which she'd taken to wearing again. "Old habits," she said when she caught him looking. "Seems like a good habit," he said. The first real sign that Silas knew came on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after the Harlan trip. One of the seasonal hands Wade had taken on for the winter, a man named Tully, who'd come recommended by a rancher to the south, and who had been unremarkable in every way for 2 months, was gone before breakfast. His bunk was empty, his gear was cleared out, and there was no note, no explanation, no request for the wages he was still owed. He'd simply walked out sometime in the night. Pepper found out and told Wade, and the two of them stood in the bunkhouse for a moment, looking at the empty bunk. "He's been here since November," Pepper said. "Never caused any trouble. Never asked anything strange." "What did he talk about?" Wade asked. "Generally." "What kind of conversations?" Pepper thought. "He was a listener," he said finally. "More than a talker. You know the type." Wade knew the type. He'd just encountered one without recognizing it. He went inside and told Marlowe. She listened without expression and said, "How much does he know?" "He's been in the bunkhouse primarily." Away from the main house, Wade thought. He wouldn't have access to the office. But he'd have heard general talk. He'd know you're here, and that you're staying, and that we've been to Harlan twice. "That's enough," Marlowe said. "That's enough for Silas to understand I'm alive and that I'm not going anywhere." She stood up from the table. "He'll move now. It's not a question of whether, it's when. What happened next arrived not all at once but in pieces. The way bad things often do, not a wall falling but a series of cracks appearing in quick succession. 3 days after Tully disappeared, Wade found a section of the north fence cut and 40 head of cattle missing from the upper pasture. The tracks in the snow showed they'd been driven south, off his property, in the direction of an area that bordered one of Silas's new claim filings. The day after that, 2 men Wade didn't recognize rode up to the main gate and asked to speak with the owner. Wade came out, and the men said they were from the Territorial Land and Resource Company, and they were there to conduct a survey of the North Creek boundary. They had papers, which Wade examined. The papers were official-looking, referenced the county land office, and cited one of the Silas filings Marlowe had found in the ledger. "This boundary is not in dispute," Wade said. "It's for the survey to determine," one of the men said pleasantly. "You're not surveying my land." The man looked at him with the comfortable patience of someone who knows they'll be back. "The county has the authority to survey contested boundaries," he said. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Callahan." They rode away, and Wade stood at the gate and watched them go, and felt the specific fury of a man being maneuvered into a corner by someone who knows the corridors better than he does. He went inside. Marlowe was already standing in the kitchen doorway. "I heard," she said. "He's accelerating. He's telling us he knows the timeline." She came inside fully and closed the door behind her. "The cattle, the surveyors, he's applying pressure. He wants me to make a decision under pressure. People make worse decisions when they're scared." "Are you scared?" She was quiet for a moment, not performing the question, actually thinking about it. "I'm worried about Daniel," she said. "That's different from scared. Scared makes you freeze. Worried makes you move." He understood the distinction. Elsie noticed. Wade hadn't wanted her to, had tried to keep the atmosphere in the house as ordinary as possible. But Elsie had the radar of a child who has grown up with one attentive parent in an otherwise quiet house, and the quality of the quiet had changed, and she noticed. She came to Marlowe rather than Wade, which Marlowe told him about afterward, which was itself a thing he filed away and thought about later. She'd found Marlowe in the back room and asked, in the direct way she had, "Is something bad going to happen?" Marlowe had thought about it. "Something difficult might happen," she'd told her. "But your father and I are working on making sure we're ready for it." Elsie had considered this. Is Silas Crow going to be the problem? Marlowe had been startled enough that she'd asked how Elsie knew about Silas. And Elsie had said that she'd heard Wade and Pepper talking in the barn when she'd gone to feed the cat, and that she'd heard the name and put it together with things she'd heard before. Because she was 5, but she wasn't stupid. Marlowe had said, "No, you're definitely not stupid." Elsie had said, "I don't like him. He has mean eyes." "You've met him?" "He came to the ranch last winter. He looked at me like I was furniture." Marlowe had not said anything to that, but she'd told Wade about it later. And the image of Silas Crow looking at his daughter like furniture sat in Wade's chest for the rest of the day and burned there quietly. He made sure Elsie was never left alone outside after that. He didn't explain why. He just changed the rules, and she accepted them with the resigned practicality of a child who has learned that adults sometimes make new rules without full explanations, and that asking too many questions about why tends to produce less information rather than more. The letter came from Silas himself on a Friday. It was formal, written on business letterhead, and it contained no threats in explicit language, because Silas was too careful for explicit language. What it contained was an offer to purchase Marlowe's inherited parcel at a price that was below market value, but not insultingly, so the kind of offer designed to look reasonable on paper, along with a note expressing his hope that the recent confusion regarding land boundaries in the northern county could be resolved amicably and without resort to the territorial courts, which he noted were slow and expensive and rarely satisfying to either party. It was a document designed to be read in evidence as a good-faith attempt at resolution. It was also, if you read it correctly, a reminder that he knew who she was, where she was, and what she had. Wade read it once and handed it to Marlowe. She read it twice, set it on the table, and said, "He thinks I'm running out of time, aren't we?" "He thinks I'm running out of time faster than he is," she said, which was a different thing. "He doesn't know what we filed with the notary. He doesn't know the Helena attorney has copies." She tapped the letter with one finger. "He's been in this territory for years, with his connections and his business and his money, and he sees a woman who came out here with nothing, who nearly died in the snow, who doesn't have local standing or local allies. He thinks the pressure he's applying is unbearable." "And is it?" She looked at him across the table. Outside, the February wind was doing what February wind in Montana does, which is to say it was making everything else seem small and impractical and alone. "I've been thinking about allies," she said. "You told me you have relationships with ranchers nearby, neighboring properties, men who have their own reasons to be wary of someone buying up land claims around the northern county." "Some," he said carefully. "Would they come if you asked?" Come for what? Come to hear a conversation, she said. Come to understand what's being built around them, one land claim at a time. Come to understand that what's happening to your ranch is a version of what's planned for theirs. Eventually, once ours is settled. She was steady when she said it, not passionate, not performing. Men protect their own interests. That's not a weakness, it's a fact. But they can't protect what they don't know is threatened. Wade thought about the ranchers he knew in the county Fletcher Oaks to the west, who had the longest tenure on his land, the Garrity brothers to the north, who were stubborn and territorial in the literal sense, old Calhoun south of Harlan, who had watched this territory change over 20 years and had opinions about every change. They were not men who trusted easily or moved quickly. They were also not men who responded well to being maneuvered. It would have to be shown to them, he said, not told. Documents, numbers, the filing sequence. They'd need to see it the way Marlowe put it together. Then that's what we show them, she said. It'll take time to arrange. How long? A week, maybe. If I ride to each place personally rather than sending word. She nodded. A week, she said. All right, what neither of them said, though they were both thinking it, was that a week might be longer than they had. Wade started the following Monday, riding out before breakfast on the first day, telling Pepper he was making neighborly calls, which was true, and not saying anything more specific than that. Pepper had the look of a man who understood that something was happening and who was choosing his questions carefully. You'll be back by dark, Pepper asked. Plan to be. Pepper looked at him for a moment. I'll keep an eye on things here. It was not a large statement. But it was a real one, and Wade took it as such. Fletcher Oaks was first, because he was closest, and because Wade had known him the longest and trusted his instincts about how a man would receive difficult information. Oaks was 61, had been on his land since before the territory was formally organized, and had the patience and stubbornness of someone who has outlasted things others thought would finish him. Wade sat with him at his kitchen table for 2 hours and showed him the account records and the land filing sequence and the survey confrontation at the gate, and Oaks listened without interrupting and then asked 3 specific questions, all of which went directly to the financial and legal mechanics of the situation, which told Wade that Oaks understood exactly what was being described. He's doing to you what Hargrove tried to do to me in '82, Oaks said finally. Hargrove tried to file on the creek access on my south boundary. I didn't catch it until it was almost too late. How'd you stop it? I found a title error in his original filing and had a lawyer challenge it in court. Took 14 months. Oaks looked at the document spread on his table. You've got something better than I had. What's that? A woman who can read an account ledger and knows what she's looking at. He paused. And if what you're telling me is true about the northern claims, Crow's not just after your land. He's after mine eventually. The drainage runs south. Yes, Wade said. Oaks was quiet for a long time. Then he said, when do you need us? The Garrity brothers were more complicated. There were 3 of them, Cal, Russ, and the youngest Emmett, who was 26 and had opinions, and they occupied a property north of the Callahan land that was adjacent to 2 of Silas's new filings. They listened to Wade with the collective skepticism of men who have been approached by people wanting something often enough to be cautious about it. Cal asked whether Wade could prove the connection between the land filings and the account fraud, and Wade showed him the documentation, and Cal passed it to Russ, and Russ passed it to Emmett, and Emmett looked up and said, who put this together? The woman who's staying at my ranch, Wade said. The mail order bride, Emmett said. Not unkindly, just directly. Yes, Emmett looked at the documents again. She did this from looking at your account books? And the land office records, where is she now? At the ranch. Emmett looked at his brothers. Something passed between them that was the compressed language of men who have grown up together and can communicate in shorthand. We'll come, Cal said. Old Calhoun south of Harlan said yes without needing more than 20 minutes of explanation, which Wade suspected had less to do with the specifics and more to do with the fact that Calhoun had been watching Silas Crow's business dealings for years with a private skepticism he'd never had sufficient cause to act on. I always knew that man was building something ugly, Calhoun said. Never could put my finger on the particular shape of it. Now you can, Wade said. Bring your woman to my place when this is done, Calhoun said. My wife wants to meet her. Wade drove home in the last of the afternoon light, the sky over the mountains going from orange to a deep bruised purple that was almost the color of snow and shadow. He thought about what he'd set in motion and whether it was enough, whether they were moving fast enough, and whether the week he'd asked for was still a week they had. He got home to find Marlowe in the office with the lamp burning, and she looked up when he came in. How did it go? Oaks both Garrity's, Calhoun, he said. They'll come, she let out a breath. Just once controlled, and then she was steady again. Good, she said. That's good, you all right? She was quiet for a moment. A man came by this afternoon, she said. While you were gone. He said he was from the county assessor's office and that he needed to speak with the property owner about tax records. Pepper turned him away. She paused. He wasn't from the assessor's office. The assessor's office doesn't send representatives to individual ranches about tax records. No, Wade agreed. They don't. He was looking to confirm I was here, she said. And now he knows. The lamp between them threw their shadows long against the wall. Wade put his hat on the hook by the door and thought about a 5-year-old sleeping down the hall, and about 40 stolen cattle, and about a man in a Harlan office who was running out of patience. How much time do you think we have? He asked. Marlowe looked at the papers on the desk. She'd been working on something while he was gone. He could see the new notations, the careful handwriting, the order she imposed on information, the way some people impose order on physical space. Less than we'd like, she said. More than he thinks we need. She picked up her pen and went back to work, and Wade pulled the second chair up to the desk and sat down beside her. And outside the Montana night settled in around the ranch with its particular cold patience, and inside the lamp kept burning. The meeting happened on a Thursday 4 days after Wade returned from his rides, which was as fast as he could get 4 separate men with 4 separate properties and 4 separate sets of obligations to appear at the same place at the same time. Marlowe had suggested holding it at the ranch, and Wade had agreed, because the ranch was the center of the situation, and there was something clarifying about meeting on contested ground rather than somewhere neutral. Neutral locations had a way of making things feel abstract. There was nothing abstract about the Callahan property. They arrived within an hour of each other, mid-morning, the horses and wagons pulling into the yard with the particular careful spacing of men who are acquainted but not intimate. Fletcher Oaks came first alone, which was his way. The Garrity brothers came together in a single wagon, Cal driving and Emmett and Russ in the back talking over each other the way they always did. Old Calhoun came last, bundled against the cold to the point of near invisibility, and climbed down from his seat with the slowness of a man whose joints had opinions about February. Mrs. Holt made coffee. Elsie was sent to her room with a book and a firmness that she accepted with dignity and minimal negotiation, though she extracted a promise from Marlowe that she'd be told the important parts later, which Marlowe agreed to without consulting Wade, which Wade noticed and didn't remark on. They sat at the long kitchen table, 6 people, and Marlowe laid out the documents in the order she'd organized them. She didn't introduce herself at length. She said her name, said that she'd been the intended target of an ambush at Red Rock Pass in December, and that Wade had found her in the snow, and said that in the time since she'd recovered, she had identified what she believed was the reason for the attack and the broader plan behind it. Then she showed them the account ledgers. Cal Garrity was the one who said what several of them were thinking. You put this together yourself? From account books? I taught school for 6 years, Marlowe said. Before that, I helped my father manage his business records. He had a small freight operation in Ohio. She paused. Numbers tell stories, if you know how to read them. These numbers tell a story about a man who has been preparing for something for a long time. She walked them through it the same way she'd walked Wade through it. Weeks earlier, the siphoned amounts, the surveying fees that didn't match invoices, the land filing sequence, the geographic logic of what Silas was assembling around the northern county properties. She did it without drama or flourish, just fact laid next to fact until the shape of it was visible to anyone paying attention. Fletcher Oaks asked 2 questions, both sharp. Calhoun asked none, just looked at the documents with an expression that suggested he was confirming something he'd suspected. Emmett Garrity leaned forward with his elbows on the table and didn't say anything for a long time, then said, He's been working this county like a chessboard. Yes, Marlowe said. For how long? At least 3 years based on the account records, possibly longer. This is only what's visible in documents I have access to. Russ Garrity, who had been quiet, said, So the question is what we do about it. The question, Marlowe said, is what we can do about it legally, with the documentation we have, and how quickly. She looked around the table. The territorial courts are the right venue. Fraud of this scale, combined with the ambush which I can testify to personally, and the cattle theft, and the intimidation, builds a case that a competent attorney can work with. Courts are slow, Calhoun said. It was the first thing he'd said, and it landed with the weight of experience. I know, Marlowe said. That's why what I need from each of you is not action yet. It's documentation. Anything in your own records that intersects with Silas Crow's business dealings. Any land approach he's made to you, any offer you've received, any survey crew that appeared on your boundary without clear authorization. Written accounts witnessed if possible. She paused. A single complainant before the territorial court is a problem Silas can manage. 5 complainants with documented evidence is a different situation entirely. The room was quiet for a moment. Oakes said, I have the paperwork from the Hargrove dispute in '82. Silas was advising Hargrove at the time. I didn't connect it then. That's useful, Marlowe said. That establishes the pattern. He's done versions of this before. I have some survey notices I received last fall that I thought were routine, Calhoun said. They didn't feel right, but I didn't know what to do with them. Write down everything you remember about who delivered them and when, any names you heard. They talked for 2 more hours, building something that hadn't existed that morning, a shared picture of what Silas Crow had been constructing in the northern county, piece by piece, over years. The individual pieces had each looked different. As a whole, they looked like something designed and deliberate. When they were done, the men stood and pulled on their coats, and Marlowe shook each of their hands, which seemed to briefly surprise some of them, and then they filed out into the cold yard and retrieved their horses and wagons. Emmett Garrity paused before he climbed up onto the wagon and looked back at Marlowe standing in the doorway. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? He thought about it. I don't know exactly, but not someone who could put together a land fraud case from a stack of account books while recovering from a gunshot wound. The wound healed faster than the situation, she said. He almost smiled, which for Emmett Garrity was the equivalent of a standing ovation, and climbed up onto the wagon. The night after the meeting, Marlowe couldn't sleep. This was not unusual. She'd had trouble sleeping since Red Rock Pass, though she wouldn't have described it as fear exactly. More like a hyper-alertness that her body couldn't quite turn off, a sensitivity to sound and movement that had saved her life in the snow, and now expressed itself at 2 a.m. as the inability to stop listening to the house settle. She'd learned to use the time. She'd done a lot of her clearest thinking between midnight and 4. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp low and a cup of cold coffee she'd forgotten to drink when she heard a step in the hallway, and Wade appeared in the doorway, fully dressed, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything about the hour. He came in and poured himself coffee and sat down across from her, and for a while they just sat there in the low light with the house quiet around them, and the cold pressing in from outside. The meeting went well, he said eventually. Better than I expected, she admitted. Calhoun surprised me. I thought he'd be the hardest to move. Calhoun's been watching Silas for years. He just needed someone to give him a framework for what he was seeing. She nodded. She was turning her coffee cup in her hands, slowly, not drinking it. You're thinking about Daniel, Wade said. I'm always thinking about Daniel, she said. It's just louder at night. He didn't try to reassure her about Daniel. He'd learned early that she didn't want reassurance. She wanted to think clearly, and reassurance got in the way of that. It was one of the things about her that he'd adjusted to more naturally than he would have predicted, given that his default tendency when someone was worried was to try to fix the worry. If Silas has him, she said carefully, he's using him as a hold on me, which means Daniel is more useful to him alive. She said it in a way that suggested she'd worked through this reasoning many times and was checking it again for cracks. He'd keep him alive as long as the situation is unresolved. And once it's resolved, that's why we need to move, she said. Before it's resolved on his terms. Wade turned his own cup in his hands, mirroring her movement without realizing it. The Helena attorney should have received our package by now. He should have. I'd feel better if we'd heard back. He'll write. These things take time. Time, she said, with the edge of someone for whom the word has become complicated. Outside, the wind came up briefly and moved through the yard and dropped again. The lamp flame bent and steadied. Can I ask you something? Wade said. She looked at him. When you took the position in Columbus, the teaching job, was that always the plan? Before your father died? She was quiet for a moment, considering whether the question was what she thought it was. No, she said. Before he died, I was going to help him run the freight operation. I'd been doing it part-time for 2 years. After he died, there was debt. More than I knew about. The freight operation had to be sold to cover it. She paused. So I taught school. It wasn't a bad life. It just wasn't mine, exactly. And the matrimonial service was practical, she said. Which I know sounds... No, he said. I contacted the service for the same reason. Practical. She looked at him for a moment. Did the letters change that? He thought about the letters, the ones he'd kept in the desk drawer through October and November, reading them more than once, the specific voice of them, the way she'd described things. Yes, he said simply. They changed it. She looked down at her coffee. I was going to say something at Red Rock Pass. When they stopped the coach, I thought. She stopped. Started again. I thought, this is what happens to people who let themselves want things. You still want things, he said. Or you wouldn't be sitting at my kitchen table at 2 a.m. planning how to take down Silas Crow. She was quiet for a moment, and then she laughed a small, real sound. Nothing performed about it, and it changed her face entirely. And he thought that was probably the most honest thing he'd seen since she'd said, I'm not an idiot about the documents sewn into her dress. Fair point, she said. 4 days later, the cattle came back. Not all of them, 31 of the 40 missing head, reappeared in the south pasture overnight, driven there by someone who'd left no tracks that held in the fresh snow. There was no note, no explanation. Just cattle that had been stolen and were now returned, which was strangers in some ways than if they'd simply stayed stolen. Pepper looked at the herd in the morning light and scratched the back of his neck. What does that mean? It means someone in Silas's operation is uncertain, Marlowe said from behind them. She'd come out with her coat pulled tight, boots leaving clean prints in the new snow. Returning stolen cattle is not what you do when you're confident. It's what you do when you're recalibrating. Or when someone told them to, Wade said. Same thing, she said. But the cattle coming back was not the main event of that week. The main event arrived on a Saturday in the form of a rider. Wade didn't recognize who came up to the main gate and asked for Marlowe Bennett by name and handed her a sealed letter and rode away before anyone could ask him questions. She opened it in the yard, with Wade beside her and Pepper watching from the barn doorway. The letter was short. It said that her brother Daniel was safe and in good health and that he would remain so as long as she was cooperative, and that a representative of the Territorial Land and Resource Company would arrive at the ranch within the week to discuss the resolution of all outstanding matters, and that she should not involve the territorial authorities, as doing so would have consequences for Daniel and for the ranch that she would find unpleasant. She read it twice, folded it, and handed it to Wade. He read it once. He knows about Daniel, she said. It wasn't surprise. She'd expected it. But hearing it confirmed was different from suspecting it, and her voice had a quality to it that hadn't been there before. He's trying to scare you into a quick decision, Wade said. That's what this is. He wants you to panic and sign something before you can think clearly. I know what it is, she said. I know exactly what it is. She looked at the road the rider had taken, already empty. But Daniel is in there somewhere, and I don't know what conditions safe actually means. Wade folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. Then we don't give him the week, he said. We move first. What moving first looked like, in practical terms, involved three things happening simultaneously, which required a level of coordination that Wade had not previously attempted, and which Marlowe organized with the methodical focus of someone who has been waiting to act and is relieved to finally be moving. The first thing was a rider to the Helena attorney, this time not with documentation but with a specific request, that he file a formal complaint with the territorial court citing fraud, criminal conspiracy, and theft, using the documented evidence already in his possession, and that he do it as quickly as the courts permitted. Wade wrote the letter, and Marlowe added a postscript that was 4 sentences long and specific, and that Wade read and thought was probably more useful than the letter itself. The second thing was a message to the Harlan sheriff, whose name was Burl Denton, a man Wade knew by reputation as steady and not easily intimidated, but also not someone who moved without cause. The message outlined the situation in plain language: the ambush, the fraud, the stolen cattle, the threatening letter, and included copies of the notarized documentation. Whether Denton would act quickly was uncertain, but having him in possession of the facts meant that whatever happened next had a witness. The third thing was the harder conversation. Wade sat down with Pepper in the barn, just the two of them, and told him everything. Not the parts he'd told him before. Everything. The account fraud, the land scheme, the full picture of what they were dealing with. He also told him that he expected something to happen at the ranch within the next several days, and that he needed to know who among the hands was reliable and who wasn't. Pepper listened to all of it. He was quiet for a long time after. Galt, he said finally, and the 2 Reynolds boys who came on in January, those 3 I'd trust with my life. The rest, Kearns and the one they call Shorty, I can't speak to. What do you want to do about Kearns and Shorty? Give them a reason to be elsewhere, Pepper said. Send them on an errand. Something that takes them 3 days. Wade thought about it. Supply run to the Eastern Depot. I can make the order large enough that it takes time. I'll arrange it, Pepper said. He looked at Wade. What do you think they're going to do when they come? I think they're going to come with enough men to make it look like they've already won, Wade said. And I think they're going to expect us to fold. Pepper nodded slowly. And we're not going to fold. No, Wade said, we're not. What they hadn't prepared for was Elsie. Not anything she did wrong. What she did wrong was come in from the cold before dark on a Wednesday, 2 days before the situation broke, and stand in the kitchen with her coat still on and say, "There are men in the tree line." Everyone in the kitchen stopped moving. "What men?" Wade said. "At least 3, maybe 4. I saw them when I went to check on the cat. They were standing in the trees on the north side of the yard." She pulled her coat off and hung it up with the calm precision of a child reporting information she considers important. "They're not doing anything, just watching." Wade looked at Marlowe. Marlowe looked at him. "Elsie," Marlowe said, "come and sit down. Are you cold a little? Come sit by the stove." While Elsie settled by the stove, Wade went to the window and looked north. He couldn't see anything in the gathering dark, which didn't mean nothing was there. Elsie was not a child who invented things. If she said she saw men in the tree line, there were men in the tree line. He went to find Pepper. Pepper sent Galt and one of the Reynolds boys to circle around the north side quietly on foot, while he and Wade covered the barn and the main approaches to the house. What they found reported back in short, clipped sentences when Galt returned were tracks. Multiple horses ridden in from the north, tied in the trees. The horses were gone now, walked out carefully before dark. But whoever had been watching had been there for at least 2 hours. Counting us, Pepper said. Counting us, Wade agreed. He sent for the Garrity's and Oaks that night. He sent a rider to each with a note that said simply, "It's time." He'd made this arrangement ahead of the meeting, a signal they'd agreed to, not a request. Just a word that meant, "Come now and come ready," which in the frontier context of men who understood the language didn't require elaboration. He didn't know whether they'd come in time. That was the part he couldn't control, and Wade was a man who disliked not controlling the parts that mattered. He went back inside and found Marlowe standing in the hallway outside Elsie's room, the door pulled halfway shut, listening to the sounds of a 5-year-old who had been put to bed and was making her considered and systematic objections to that fact from inside. Marlowe looked at him. "Oaks and the Garrity's are coming," he said quietly. "How long if they ride tonight morning, if they wait for light midday?" She nodded. She looked at the door, then back at him. "I've been thinking about the marriage contract," she said. He blinked. "Now? Not for no," a brief, strained expression. "Not for that. I've been thinking that Silas needs it. The original contract from the matrimonial service, with both our names and the service's seal on it. Without it, he can't prove the intended marriage, and therefore can't make a legal argument about the parcel passing through marital consolidation." She paused. "He knows I have it. It was one of the things his men were looking for at Red Rock Pass." "Do you have it?" "Yes, I kept it." Wade was quiet for a moment. "Where is this going?" "He's going to come here and make demands," she said. "He's going to present Daniel as his leverage and expect me to fold. What if I let him think that's working?" She held his gaze. "What if I give him a reason to bring his operation here, to this property, rather than letting him act from a distance where we can't respond directly? You want to use the contract as bait." "I want to give him something to reach for," she said, "so that when he reaches for it, we can see exactly where his hand is." Wade looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the 31 cattle that had come back in the night. He thought about men standing in the tree line counting heads. He thought about a letter that used the word consequences as a synonym for threat, while maintaining the careful surface of a business communication. "It's dangerous," he said. "I know. He won't come alone. I know that too." From inside the room, Elsie made one more objection to being in bed, something about the cat needing company, and then went quiet. Marlowe looked at the door. When she looked back, her expression had something in it that was not hardness, but was adjacent to it the look of someone who has made a decision and is not going back on it. "He came after me because he decided I was manageable," she said. "He decided I was someone who would panic, who would sign things under pressure, who didn't have the standing to fight back in this territory." Her voice was level. "I want him to come here and see that he was wrong about every part of that." Wade took a slow breath. Outside, the February night had settled fully over the property, cold and dark and enormous in the way this country always was, indifferent to what happened under it. "All right," he said, "we make it a trap." They worked through most of the night. Pepper moved the bulk of the cattle out before midnight, driving them quietly to the far south pasture with Galt and the Reynolds brothers in a slow, dark procession that left the near pastures empty and the barn accessible. This was deliberate. They were making the property look undefended, giving approaching men the visual impression of a ranch unprepared for company. Positions were set and discussed and adjusted based on the lay of the land, and where cover existed, and where men with bad intentions would naturally place themselves if they were trying to control the approaches. Marlowe walked the property with Wade in the dark, both of them moving quietly, while she committed the layout to memory with the thoroughness of someone who expects to need it. "Here," she said at one point, stopping near the north side of the barn. "If they come from the tree line, this is where they'll push toward first. The barn is the closest cover," agreed. "Then here has to be covered." Galt. She nodded. She moved, he moved with her, and they worked around the property in the cold until she was satisfied she understood it from the inside out. They came back in close to 3 a.m. and found Mrs. Holt awake in the kitchen, which surprised Wade, though Marlowe seemed less surprised. Mrs. Holt had made fresh coffee and set out bread, and didn't say anything about the hour. She just poured and let them sit and drink. After a while she said, "To no one in particular, my first husband was a difficult man. Got into business with someone who turned out to be worse." She said it without drama, looking at her own coffee cup. "Took us 3 years to get clear of that situation. I always wished we'd moved faster." Neither Wade nor Marlowe said anything. "That's all," Mrs. Holt said, "just saying." She got up and went back to bed. They sat there in the quiet kitchen, the lamp between them, and drank their coffee. "She's steadier than she looks," Marlowe said. "She's steadier than most people look," Wade said. The Garrity brothers arrived at first light, which told Wade that they'd ridden through the night, which had told him something about their read of the situation. Oakes came 2 hours later, with a rifle across his saddle that he hadn't carried the first time he visited, and 2 men Wade didn't know who turned out to be Oakes's adult sons, neither of whom said much, but both of whom had the posture of men who knew what they were there for. They gathered in the barn, all of them together, and Wade went through the plan in plain language. No elegance to it. No complex mechanics. They were going to present the appearance of an ordinary ranch day, with Marlowe in the house and the contract visible on the office desk, and they were going to wait. When Silas or his men arrived, they were going to let them come in, far enough to see what they were reaching for, and then they were going to close the yard. "What about the sheriff?" Cal Garrity asked. "He has the documentation. Whether he comes is his decision, and the woman's brother? If he's brought here as leverage, we treat it accordingly," Wade said. "Nobody moves until we know where Daniel is." Cal looked at Marlowe, who was standing beside Wade with her arms crossed and her jaw set. "You understand that your brother being here complicates it considerably," he said, not unkindly. "I understand completely," she said. "That's why I need to be the one who makes first contact when they come. Not Wade, me." She looked around at them. "He thinks he's coming to collect from a frightened woman. Let him think that for as long as possible," Emmett Garrity said. "You're going to walk out there alone." "Yes, with the contract." "Yes, and we'll be positioned," Wade said in a tone that closed the conversation. Emmett looked at him, then back at Marlowe. He shook his head slowly, not in refusal, but in the particular male gesture of someone who has processed something and accepted it but wants the record to show he had feelings about it. "All right," he said. They didn't have long to wait. They came in the early afternoon, which was a reasonable time, enough light to see clearly, late enough that a working ranch would have its hands spread across the property and potentially not at full attention. 7 riders, which was more than Wade had hoped for, and about what he'd feared. They came from the north track, not the tree line, which meant they were making a show of it. They were not trying to be subtle. In the lead on a gray horse was Silas Crow. Wade watched from the window and felt something clarify in him, not the hot anger of the past weeks, but something colder and more useful. Silas looked exactly as he always did, composed, correctly dressed for the frontier in the way of a man who has money and pays attention to appearances, the kind of person who manages to look like he belongs everywhere. Beside Silas, on a horse he clearly wasn't comfortable on, was a young man in his 20s with Marlowe's jaw, and none of her composure, looking around the yard with the wide, exhausted eyes of someone who has been afraid for a long time. Daniel Bennett, alive, upright, and from this distance apparently uninjured, though the distance was too great to be certain. Marlowe was already at the front door. Wade said, "Wait." "I'm waiting," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands at her sides were not quite. They let the riders come to the middle of the yard. Let them stop and settle and look around at what appeared to be an ordinary ranch afternoon. The barn, the house, the pastures beyond. Quiet. Apparently empty of the things that should concern them. Then Marlowe opened the door and walked out. She walked across the porch and down the 3 steps into the yard and stopped. She had the marriage contract in her left hand, folded once, visible but not extended. She looked at Silas Crow the way she'd told Wade she was going to look at him, not with fear, not with anger, with the flat, steady attention of someone who sees another person exactly for what they are. Silas looked back at her with the slight shift, an expression of a man who has been surprised by something but is not going to show it. He'd expected her. He just hadn't expected her to look like that. "Miss Bennett," he said. "I'm glad to see you've recovered." "Mr. Crow," she said. "I see you brought my brother." Silas glanced at Daniel with the brief, dismissive attention of a man acknowledging a tool he's carrying. "Daniel has been my guest," he said. "He's been comfortable." "He doesn't look comfortable," Marlowe said. "These things are relative." He looked at the paper in her hand. "I believe we have business to conclude." "We do," she said. "But before we conclude it, I want you to understand something." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "The notarized documentation of your fraud against the Callahan accounts is in the hands of a Helena attorney who filed formal complaint with the territorial court 3 days ago. Sheriff Denton of Harlan has received copies. Fletcher Oakes, the Garrity brothers, and Thomas Calhoun have each provided sworn written accounts of your dealings with their properties." She paused for exactly long enough. "You came here to pressure one woman. What you've actually done is give 4 ranchers and a territorial court a reason to look very closely at everything you've built in this county." The yard was very quiet. Silas looked at her. His expression had gone through several things and settled into something that was harder to read, not panic, because he was not a man who panicked, but a recalculation. She could see it happening. The man was genuinely intelligent, and genuinely intelligent men don't stop thinking just because the situation has shifted. Those are serious allegations, he said carefully. Allegations require proof. I have proof, she said. That's what I just told you. He looked at the contract in her hand. That document is the core of this situation, he said. Without a completed marriage, your father's parcel remains. Already filed, she said. The deed was filed with the Harlan Land Office under my name 4 days ago. The parcel is mine, the title is clear, and it is not for sale. She let that sit for a moment. Not to you, not to anyone connected to you, not at any price. Something shifted in Silas's face then, not visible to everyone probably. But she was watching for it, and she saw at the moment he understood that the situation had moved past the point where his preferred resolution was available. That was the moment he made the mistake. He said quietly, to the man closest to him on the right, burn it. The man reached for something at his saddle, and the barn doors opened. Pepper came out first with Galt and both Reynolds' boys, and then Oakes's sons appeared from behind the outbuilding on the east side, and Cal and Russ Garrity came around the south corner of the house, and Emmett Garrity stepped into the open on the north side of the yard, and the 7 riders found themselves in the center of a yard that was no longer empty. The man who'd reached for his saddle stopped reaching. Silas looked around the yard with the careful attention of a man counting odds. He was good at counting. He counted and understood, and his face did something complicated. And from the north track, arriving with the timing of something that had been hoped for but not promised, came Sheriff Burl Denton of Harlan with 2 deputies, riding at an unhurried pace that nonetheless arrived at exactly the right moment. Denton pulled up at the edge of the yard and looked at the situation with the expression of a man who has seen many things and is prepared to deal with this one. His eyes went to Silas, then to the riders, then to Marlowe standing alone in the middle of the yard with a piece of paper in her hand. Mr. Crow, Denton said, I've been meaning to talk to you. Silas looked at Marlowe, and for the first time since he'd ridden into that yard, he looked like a man who understood that he had been outmaneuvered. Marlowe looked back at him without blinking. In the middle of that frozen February yard, with the cold pressing down on everything, and the mountains white in every direction, the thing Silas Crow had spent years building quietly began at last to come apart. Silas Crow did not go quietly. That was the first thing, and it mattered, because there had been a part of Wade that had expected, or maybe hoped that confronting the man with the full weight of what had been assembled against him would produce a kind of collapse, the moment of reckoning, the confession, the deflation of a man who has been caught and knows it. Silas was not that kind of man. What he did instead, in the 30 seconds after Sheriff Denton rode into the yard, was speak quietly to the rider, on his immediate left too quietly for anyone more than a few feet away to catch the words, and then raise both hands in the open, cooperative gesture of someone who has nothing to hide and everything to offer, and turned to face Denton with an expression of concerned bewilderment that would have been convincing to anyone who didn't already know better. Burl, he said, I'm glad you're here. There seems to be some kind of misunderstanding. Denton looked at him from the saddle for a moment. Then he looked at Marlowe. Then he looked at the 7 riders distributed around the yard and the ranchers and hands positioned at the barn and the building corners. Looks like more than a misunderstanding, Denton said. Miss Bennett has made some serious accusations. I've read the accusations, Denton said. I've also read the documentation. He climbed down from his horse and handed the reins to one of his deputies. Why don't we go inside, Silas, and talk through a few things? What Denton had read, what had arrived at his office 3 days prior, in a packet that Marlowe had assembled with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, was 12 pages of documented evidence. Account discrepancies going back 31 months. Land filing sequences showing the geographic logic of what the Territorial Land and Resource Company had been building. The notarized affidavit from Agnes Purcell. A sworn statement from Fletcher Oakes connecting the Hargrove boundary dispute of 1882 to Silas's advisory role in that situation. And Marlowe's own account of the ambush at Red Rock Pass, signed and witnessed, describing the men, their questions, and the specific knowledge they demonstrated about her travel arrangements. 12 pages. Denton was not a fast reader by his own admission, but he was a thorough one. Silas's expression, for just a fraction of a second before he composed it back into concerned cooperation, showed that he understood the packet had been more comprehensive than he'd calculated for. Of course, Silas said pleasantly. Happy to talk. The talking happened in Wade's front room, which was not a large space and felt smaller with 6 people in it. Denton and 1 deputy, Silas, Wade, Marlowe, and Emmett Garrity, who had positioned himself by the door with the particular stillness of a man who is there in a specific capacity and knows it. Daniel was in the kitchen with Mrs. Holt, who had taken one look at him when he climbed off the horse, thin, winter pale, moving like someone who'd been confined somewhere small for weeks and had produced bread and soup with the efficient compassion of a woman who deals with problems by feeding them. Marlowe had gone to him first, before anything else, a brief exchange in the yard that Wade hadn't tried to hear, and whatever had passed between them had left Daniel sitting at the kitchen table, looking slightly less like a man who expected the floor to drop out from under him. In the front room, Silas settled into the offered chair, with the ease of someone accustomed to occupying spaces on his own terms. He looked at the documents Denton laid on the table between them and said nothing for a moment. "These accounts," Denton said, tapping the ledger copies. 12 months of discrepancies. You've been managing, Mr. Callahan's business finances for 3 years, I have," Silas said, "and I'd be happy to review any concerns about those records. Accounting is a complex matter. Numbers that appear inconsistent often have explanations that aren't immediately visible." "Walk me through one," Denton said. Silas looked at him. "Pick any one of these discrepancies," Denton said, "and walk me through the explanation." The room was quiet. Silas looked at the papers with the careful attention of a man reading a situation rather than a document. He picked up one of the pages, studied it, set it down. "I'd need my own records to speak to specific line items," he said. "These are copies. I can't verify their accuracy." "The originals are in the notarial record in Harlan," Marlowe said from her position near the window. "Agnes Purcell's seal is on every page." Silas looked at her. It was not the look of a man who had underestimated a woman and was recalibrating. It was more considered than that. More like the look of someone adjusting to a changed landscape with the professional attention of a man who has navigated changed landscapes before. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I understand you've been through a very difficult experience. The attack on the stagecoach was a terrible thing. But I want to be clear that I had nothing to do with that violence." "Then who did?" she said. "There are rough men in this territory," he said. "Opportunists. A woman traveling alone with valuable documents. They knew my route," she said. "They knew my timing. They knew I was carrying papers related to my father's estate. That information was in correspondence that was available to a small number of people, one of whom is sitting in this room." Silas spread his hands in a gesture of regret. "Correspondence can be intercepted," he said. "The matrimonial service itself could have had a breach. There are any number of— The matrimonial service didn't know my route," she said. "They knew I was going to Montana. That's all. The specific pass, the specific date, the specific coach that came from letters exchanged between Mr. Callahan and me, which were in his possession, which you had access to when you came to review the November accounts." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "That's a very neat theory," he said. "It's a documented one," she said. Denton had been listening to all of this with his elbows on his knees and his hat in his hands, and he looked up now and said, "Silas, I've known you for a long time. I want to give you the opportunity to get ahead of this. The territorial court is going to receive this complaint whether we talk today or not. The question is how this proceeds from here." Something moved across Silas's face. It was the calculation of a man who has spent his whole life assessing what each moment is actually worth and responding accordingly. "I think," he said carefully, "that I should speak with an attorney before we continue." "That's your right," Denton said. He nodded to his deputy. "In the meantime, you'll be coming to Harlan with us." The riders in the yard were the harder problem. 6 men, not counting Silas, and without Silas actively directing them, the question of what they would do when he was walked out of the house was not entirely predictable. These were not men who had signed on for their own convictions. They'd been hired, and hired men, without a clear signal from whoever is paying them, exist in a specific kind of uncertainty that can go several ways. Wade had thought about this. So had Pepper. What they'd decided in their conversation in the barn 2 days prior was that the appearance of the situation mattered as much as the reality of it. Men who are outnumbered, and clearly so, and who do not have strong personal investment in the outcome, make different choices than men who think they have options. So they'd made sure that when the riders looked around the yard, they saw more people than they expected, in positions that covered the approaches, with the calm body language of men who are prepared rather than tense. It worked mostly. When Denton's deputy came out and told the riders that Silas would be accompanying the sheriff to Harlan, and that those who had no outstanding legal concerns were free to leave, 5 of the 6 looked at each other and, over the course of about 90 seconds of wordless deliberation, decided that their connection to this situation was not worth the alternative. They rode out in 1s and 2s without any drama, and the yard let them go. The 6th man was the one who had reached for his saddle when Silas had said, "Burn it." He was younger than the others, early 20s, with the kind of face that looks like it hasn't decided yet what it's going to become. He stayed on his horse after the others left and looked at the barn, and then at the house, and then at Wade, who had come back out to the porch. "I didn't burn anything," he said. "No," Wade said. "He told me to." "I didn't." Wade looked at him. The young man's horse was shifting beneath him, picking up on the tension in the rider's body. "What's your name?" Wade asked. "Alton." "Alton. How long have you worked for Crow?" 4 months. "Did you know about the woman in the stagecoach?" Alton's jaw tightened. "I wasn't there for that. That was before my time," he paused. "I heard about it after. And you stayed." "I needed the work." He said it without apology, but also without comfort. Just the plain fact of a man's situation in winter. Wade looked at him for a moment longer. "If the sheriff asks you what you know, you tell him. All of it, whatever you heard, whatever you saw. You do that, and you're not the problem in this situation." Alton thought about it. Then he turned his horse toward the north track and stopped once more. "There's a man named Dix," he said. "Crow's man in the south part of the county. He was at Red Rock Pass. I wasn't, but he was." He paused. "Thought you should know that name." He rode out. Wade stood on the porch and filed the name away and went back inside. The conversation between Marlowe and Daniel happened that evening. After Denton and his deputies had taken Silas north toward Harlan, and the Garrity's and Oaks had eaten supper at the ranch table and headed home with the acknowledgement that this was not over but that today had gone well. Pepper had put Galt on watch, a rotation through the night. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone understood that Silas's removal from the yard didn't mean his reach was gone. He had other men in the county, other arrangements, and until the territorial court had formally acted, the situation remained unstable. Marlowe and Daniel sat in the back room, door half closed, and Wade gave them the privacy of it. He sat in the kitchen with Mrs. Holt and drank coffee, and listened to the low murmur of voices without trying to hear the words, which was easy enough since Mrs. Holt kept up a quiet, steady commentary on the practical matters of the house that served as both genuine information and a polite noise screen. When Marlowe came out an hour later, she looked like someone who has been handed back, something they thought they'd lost for good, and is not quite sure yet whether to believe they have it. "He's all right," she said. "He's shaken. They kept him in a boarding house in the South County for most of it. Told him you'd been killed in the snow." She said this last part flatly. "They told him I was dead." Wade was quiet. "He believed it for 3 weeks," she said. "He'd written to Mrs. Aldrich, that's why there was no reply. He was grieving." She sat down at the table and didn't pick up her coffee. "He wanted to come here anyway, to see the place I'd been going. He said he wanted to understand what I'd wanted." The kitchen was quiet. "That's when Silas's men picked him up," she said. On the road west, Wade sat with this for a moment. The specific cruelty of it, using a brother's grief as a vehicle for capture, settled in the room like something with its own weight. "He's going to need time," she said, "to find his footing. He can't go back to Columbus right now. He gave up his rooms. And he doesn't." She stopped. "He can stay," Wade said. She looked at him. "There's room," he said. "He can stay here while things are resolved. If he's willing to work, there's work." He paused. "If he's not, there's also that. But he should stay." Marlowe looked at him for a long moment with an expression he was getting better at reading, the one where she was checking whether what she'd just heard was what she thought she'd heard. "Wade, what? You understand this is not how any of this was supposed to go." "No," he agreed. "None of it is how it was supposed to go." She laughed, shortly, and this time it was a slightly broken sound, the kind that comes when something that has been held tight for a very long time releases a little. She put her hands over her face briefly. Then she put them down and squared herself back up. "All right," she said. "Thank you." Daniel Bennett turned out to be a revelation which no one had predicted, and which everyone who encountered him seemed to register with slight surprise. He was 22 years old, and had his sister's directness, and none of her composure, which meant he felt everything loudly, and said half of what he felt without apparent filtering, which in a household that had been operating at a high level of controlled tension for weeks was occasionally disorienting and occasionally a relief. He asked Wade about the cattle operation with genuine curiosity, and then went out the following morning and got in the way of Pepper's work with the enthusiastic uselessness of someone who has never been near cattle but is determined to learn. Pepper managed this with patience that surprised Wade until he saw that Pepper was actually teaching, rather than tolerating, which told him something about Pepper he hadn't known. Elsie decided she liked Daniel within approximately 4 hours of his arrival, which she communicated by starting to follow him around with the book she was currently working through and asking him to listen to her read. Daniel listened with the complete attention of someone who had grown up with a sister who taught school and understood that being listened to was a serious matter. It was Elsie who said, on the third evening, while they were all at supper, without looking up from her plate, "Is Marlowe going to stay?" The table went quiet. Wade looked at Marlowe. Marlowe looked at Elsie. Daniel looked at his soup with the careful attention of someone deciding to be very interested in it. "Where else would I go?" Marlowe said. Elsie looked up. "I don't know. Somewhere that's not here, maybe. Since the bad things happened here." "Bad things happen in most places," Marlowe said. "It's not the place's fault." Elsie considered this. "Is it fixed now?" Not entirely, Marlowe said, but it's getting there. Elsie returned to her plate, satisfied enough for now, and the table resumed eating with the slightly altered atmosphere of people who have just had a frank conversation under the guise of a child asking simple questions. Wade didn't say anything, but he caught Marlowe's eye across the table and held it for a moment, and something passed between them that didn't need to be said yet to be real. The problem with getting there was that getting there was not a smooth or linear process. Denton had taken Silas to Harlan, and Silas had spent 2 days in the county jail before a lawyer arrived from the eastern part of the territory and arranged bail on the grounds that the charges, while serious, were civil in nature, and that Silas was a known and established businessman with no prior legal history and significant ties to the community. Wade heard this from Pepper, who'd gotten it from the feed supplier, who'd heard it in Harlan, he told Marlowe. She didn't look surprised. I expected that, she said. The fraud charges take time to move through the court. He has money and connections, and he'll use them. She was quiet for a moment. Dix is the more immediate concern. The name Alton had given Wade before he wrote out Dix. The man who'd been at Red Rock Pass had not left Marlowe's thinking since she'd heard it. Dix was not a name in any of the documentation they'd assembled, which meant he existed in the part of Silas's operation that didn't leave paper trails, which was the more dangerous part. A man like that, with Silas released on bail and his options narrowing, became unpredictable in specific ways. Do you think he'll come here? Wade asked. I think if Silas decides that destroying evidence is worth the risk, then yes, she said. The notarized copies in Harlan he can't touch. The originals here are a different matter. She looked at him. Where are the originals? The floor safe in the office, he said. Under the rug. Who knows it's there? Me, Pepper. You. Not Daniel? No. She nodded. Let's keep it that way for now. She stood up. I want to move the documents. Where? Somewhere that's not the obvious place, she said. In my experience, men who are looking for something in a hurry go for the obvious place first. They moved the originals that night, and Wade didn't ask where she put them, because he decided that 2 people knowing was better than 3, and that she'd made the same calculation. Dix arrived on a Thursday. He didn't come to the main gate. He came in from the east, which was the approach they'd covered least thoroughly because it was the longest route from anywhere significant, and therefore the least likely. He came at midday rather than at night, which was also unexpected, and which suggested either confidence or stupidity. And in Wade's experience, men who operated for people like Silas were rarely stupid. Wade was in the east pasture when he saw the rider. He didn't know immediately that it was Dix. It was just a rider, unfamiliar, moving at a pace that was deliberate rather than urgent. He watched for a moment and then turned his horse and rode back toward the barn at a pace slightly faster than ordinary. And he caught Pepper's eye when he came into the yard and tilted his head in the direction of the east pasture, and Pepper put down what he was doing. The rider came into the yard and stopped. He was a compact man, somewhere in his 40s, with the kind of face that doesn't offer information, not unfriendly, not threatening, just neutral in the comprehensive way of someone who has made neutrality into a professional tool. He looked around the yard with the careful eyes of someone taking inventory. Help you? Wade said. Looking for the woman, the man said. Marlowe Bennett. On what business? Private business, the man said. Between her and me. There's no private business here, Wade said. Whatever you have to say to anyone on this property, you say it with me present. The man looked at him steadily. That's not how this works, he said. That's exactly how this works, Wade said. What's your name? The man considered whether to answer. Dix, he said. The name landed in the yard the way a stone lands in water, and Wade watched Pepper's posture change slightly in his peripheral vision. Mr. Dix, Wade said, I know who you are. I know where you were in December. I know who sent you. Whatever message Silas Crow has for Marlowe Bennett, you can deliver it through his attorney, who can deliver it through ours, which is the proper channel for people who want to avoid additional legal complications. He held the man's eyes. You should turn around and ride back the way you came. Dix looked at him for a long moment. He looked at Pepper. He looked at the barn, where the door was open, and Galt was visible doing something with harness, and not looking at anyone but also clearly present. He did the same count that Silas had done in this yard 10 days before, and arrived at the same conclusion. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Dix said. I'm making it exactly as hard as it needs to be, Wade said. Dix turned his horse. He stopped once at the edge of the yard and looked back, and the look was the kind that is meant to be remembered. Then he rode east, and the yard held its breath until he was out of sight. Pepper exhaled. That's the man from the pass.
Yes.
He's going to come back. Maybe, Wade said. Or maybe he goes back to Silas and tells him the ranch isn't accessible and Silas decides it's not worth the additional charge. He paused. Silas is on bail. He's not going to want anything traceable happening while he's waiting for his attorney to work. You believe that? Wade thought about it honestly. Mostly, he said. The next 2 weeks were the strangest of all because they were almost ordinary. The court machinery moved slowly as courts do, but it moved. The Helena attorney sent word that the formal complaint had been docketed and that a preliminary hearing was scheduled for March, which was 6 weeks away but was still movement. Oakes sent a written account, properly witnessed, that added the Hargrove connection to the evidence record. Calhoun sent his survey notices. The Garrities, after some internal debate whose details were not shared with anyone outside the family, produced 3 years of their own account records that showed irregularities in land survey fees that matched the pattern in Wade's ledgers with close enough specificity to establish the same hand at work. Silas, through his attorney, offered a settlement. It came in the form of a formal legal document, carefully worded, that proposed the dismissal of the fraud charges in exchange for a monetary payment, the withdrawal of the Territorial Land and Resource Company's Northern County claims, and a commitment to no further business dealings with any of the complaining parties. It did not address the ambush at Red Rock Pass. It did not mention Daniel. It acknowledged nothing. Marlowe read it once and set it on the desk. "He wants to make this go away quietly," she said. "It's a lot of money," Wade said. He'd looked at the figure. "It is," she said. "It's also the amount a man offers when he thinks the alternative is worse for him than the money." She looked at the document. "If we take the settlement, he faces no criminal consequence for what happened at Red Rock Pass. The driver who was killed, he has no one pressing for that. We accept this and it goes away." Wade was quiet. "I'm not going to take it," she said. "I know. You don't have objections?" "I have the same objections you do," he said. "A man is dead. Your brother was held against his will for weeks. You were left in the snow," he paused. "Those don't settle for money." She looked at him, and again there was that quality of checking, of verifying that what she'd heard was what she'd thought. "Some people would take the money," she said. "Some people would," he agreed. They sent back a formal rejection through the Helena attorney, with a note that the criminal matters were not the complainant's to dismiss, and that the territorial prosecutor's office would need to be consulted on those components, which was both true and a way of making clear that this was not going away on Silas's preferred terms. The preliminary hearing was in March, and by the time it arrived, the winter had begun to loosen its grip, in the particular grudging way of Montana springs not warm, not welcoming, but incrementally less brutal, the kind of change you register by degree. The days got longer by minutes that added up to hours, and the snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, and the creek showed itself again in the upper pasture. They rode to Harlan for the hearing in a group: Wade, Marlowe, Daniel, Oakes, and the Garrities, which was both a practical necessity and a statement. The hearing room in Harlan's territorial courthouse was small and smelled of wood stove and old paper, and the particular closed-in quality of a space that sees too many difficult conversations. Silas was there with 2 attorneys, which told you something about where he'd put his resources in the past 6 weeks. He was dressed as he always dressed, carefully and correctly, and his expression was the controlled neutrality of a man who has made peace with the day's odds without accepting them. He looked at Marlowe when she came in. She looked back at him, the same way she'd looked at him in the yard, flat, clear, without heat, like looking at something she had already fully understood and had no more need to be surprised by. The judge was a woman named Hargrove, no relation to the rancher. She clarified at the outset, with the brisk tone of someone who'd had to say this before, who went through the preliminary matters, with the organized efficiency of a person who understands that the room's time is not infinite. She reviewed the complaint, the documentation, the settlement rejection, and the scope of the criminal referral to the prosecutor's office, and asked questions that were specific and showed she had read the materials. Silas's attorney argued that the documented discrepancies were accounting differences that required expert review rather than criminal interpretation, that the land claims of the Territorial Land and Resource Company were legally filed and properly documented, and that no direct connection had been established between his client and the events at Red Rock Pass. The prosecutor's representative, a young man from the territorial office named Hatch, who had a precise manner and a quality of contained intensity that suggested someone who took their work personally, said that the state had interviewed Alton Marsh. The name turned out to be Alton Marsh, and that Marsh had provided a sworn account of conversations he'd witnessed between Crow and a man named Dix regarding the interception of a specific stagecoach on a specific date, which constituted conspiracy to commit robbery and assault, and potentially serious charges pending the investigation into the stagecoach driver's death. The room was very quiet after that. Silas's attorney said his client had no knowledge of any such conversations. Hatch said that was a matter for the jury to evaluate. Judge Hargrove said she found sufficient basis to proceed to trial and set a date in June, and reminded everyone present of their obligations regarding the preservation of evidence and the prohibition against contact with witnesses. She looked at Silas directly when she said the last part. It was not a long look, but it was the kind that judges sometimes give when they want the record to reflect that something has been noted. Walking out of the courthouse into the March air, which was cold but carried a quality that full winter didn't, a smell of something dormant beginning to reconsider. Marlowe stopped on the steps and stood still for a moment. Wade stopped beside her. The town of Harlan moved around them with its ordinary activity. People going about the business of a county seat on a Thursday morning, horses at the posts and wagons on the street, and the sounds of a working town. Ordinary, specific, entirely real. It's going to trial, Marlowe said. Yes. It'll take months. Yes, she breathed out. I'll have to testify, you will, so will Daniel. He paused. So will I. She looked at the street for a moment. Behind them, through the courthouse door, she could hear voices, the Garrity's talking to Oakes. Something about the spring grass conditions, the conversation of men who have done what they came to do and have turned their minds back toward their land. It was so ordinary it was almost strange. The driver's name was Amos Farr, she said quietly. I found it out last week. He had a wife in Billings. 2 children, she paused. I wrote to the prosecutor and told them, in case no one else had thought to provide a name. Wade looked at her. He shouldn't just be the driver, she said. In the record, he should be Amos Farr. They stood on the steps for another moment, and then Daniel appeared behind them and said something to Marlowe in the quick overlapping way he had of talking that required her full attention to follow, and she turned to answer him. And Oakes came out behind them and clapped Wade on the shoulder and said something about the road conditions heading west, and the group of them moved down the steps and into the street, and the ordinary world absorbed them back into itself the way it does, relentlessly and without ceremony. That evening, back at the ranch, in the last of the afternoon light before supper, Wade found Marlowe at the fence line of the north pasture, looking at the upper creek where it came down through the gap in the boundary that her father's 40 acres had filled in. The water was moving again under the remnant ice, visible in the places where the thaw had opened it, dark and quick and real. She heard him come up and didn't turn around. The letter I wrote to you, she said. In October, the first one. Yes, I rewrote it 4 times, she said. I couldn't decide how honest to be. What did you decide? That honest was the only thing that would work, she said. With someone like you. She paused. I could tell from your first letter. The kind of man you were. That you'd know if I was performing something. He stood beside her at the fence and looked at the water. I kept rereading yours, he said, trying to figure out whether you were who you seemed like. Did you decide? I decided I wanted to find out, he said, which was answer enough. The sun was going down behind the mountains, and the cold was coming back with it. The particular evening cold of early spring that reminds you the season hasn't committed to anything yet. The creek moved through the gap in the pasture with the indifferent persistence of water that goes where the land takes it, and the ranch settled around them into the end of another day, and Elsie's voice carried from somewhere near the barn, high and clear, arguing with Daniel about something that sounded entirely unimportant and entirely real. We should go in, Marlowe said. We should, Wade agreed. Neither of them moved for another moment. Then they turned together and walked back toward the house, and the light went gold and then gray behind them, and the water kept moving through the land that now, legally and finally and on record, was theirs. The trial began on a Tuesday in June, which was the kind of June day that Montana occasionally offers as a form of apology for everything it puts you through the rest of the year. Sky so blue it looked painted, air that smelled of grass and distance, the mountains white only at their very tops now, the rest of them green and brown, and present in the way that large things are present when they stop being hidden by weather. The Harlan courthouse filled up in ways it hadn't for the preliminary hearing. People came from the surrounding ranches and the town itself, and some from further county, because the story had traveled the way stories do in places where there isn't much else to talk about, not accurately in all its details, but in its essential shape, which was that a woman had come west as a mail-order bride and nearly died in the snow, and then turned out to be the person who unraveled the largest fraud the county had seen in 20 years. People had opinions about that. They came to see how it resolved. Marlowe sat at the complainant's table in a dress she'd made herself over the winter, dark blue wool. Nothing elaborate, because she was not a woman who dressed for rooms. She sat with her back straight and her hands folded on the table in front of her and looked at the proceedings with the same attention she'd given to everything else, since December, focused, present, not performing anything. Wade sat in the gallery behind her. He'd asked if she wanted him at the table, and she'd said no, that she needed to be the one facing the room, that having him beside her would change how the room read the situation, and she was right, and he knew it, and sat where she'd asked him to sit. Daniel was next to him. Elsie was at the ranch with Mrs. Holt, because whatever Elsie's understanding of the world was, a trial was not the appropriate education for a 5-year-old, a position Elsie had contested at length and ultimately lost. Silas Crowe sat at the defense table with two attorneys and the settled composure of a man who has been in difficult rooms before and has survived them. He did not look at Marlowe when the proceedings began. He looked at the judge, at his attorneys, at the documents placed before him, a man reducing the room to its functional components. He didn't look at Marlowe until she took the stand. She had prepared for this the way she prepared for everything methodically, without illusion about what it would be. She'd gone through her account with the prosecutor Hatch 3 times, each time with him pressing on the places that defense attorneys press on, building her toward the version of the testimony that would hold up under that pressure without becoming rigid or rehearsed. Hatch was good at this. He'd said, in their last session, that the most dangerous thing a witness could do was try to be more certain than they actually were, that juries felt the seams in overclaimed testimony the way you feel a floorboard that isn't quite nailed down. Say what you know, he'd told her. Exactly what you know. Nothing that's inference. Some of it is inference, she'd said. Then say it as inference. I believed and it appeared to me are not weaknesses. Their precision, she'd taken that in. She was good at precision. On the stand, she told what had happened at Red Rock Pass in the plain, sequential language of someone describing events they lived through, the coach stopping, the men on the road, the driver's name, Amos Farr, which she said deliberately, and watched the jury hear, the questions about the documents, the cold of the snow, and the 2 days she was in it before Wade found her. She was not dramatic about any of it. She didn't need to be. The facts were sufficiently dramatic on their own. Silas's lead attorney was a man named Corbett, who had the smooth professional manner of someone paid to find gaps. He found what gaps he could. He pushed on the question of whether she had directly heard anyone say Silas Crowe's name at Red Rock Pass, and she said no, she had not. He pushed on whether any of the account discrepancies she'd identified could have innocent explanations rooted in accounting methodology rather than fraud, and she said it was possible, but that the pattern over 31 months, taken together, was not consistent with methodology, it was consistent with intention. He pushed on whether she'd had any prior personal connection to Silas Crowe before the events of the winter, and she said no. So your belief that my client orchestrated the attack on you, Corbett said, is based on inference, not direct evidence. My belief that he orchestrated it is based on inference, she said. The documented account fraud is not inference. Land filing sequence is not inference. The testimony of Alton Marsh connecting your client directly to the planning of the interception is not inference. She paused. One beat. I'm only one piece of evidence. I don't need to be all of it. Corbett looked at her for a moment. Then he said he had no further questions, with the careful neutral tone of an attorney declining to press a witness who has just demonstrated that she will not be pressed. Alton Marsh testified on the 3rd day. He was young enough that the room looked at him with the particular attention people give to youth in serious situations, the sense of watching someone who has not yet fully calculated what this moment will cost them and is doing it anyway. He sat in the stand and told what he'd heard in plain language, without embellishment, a conversation between Silas Crowe and a man he knew as Dix, in the South County boarding house that Silas used for meetings he didn't want held in his office, in which the stagecoach route and the date and the woman who would be carrying documents were discussed. He said Silas had used the word necessary when talking about what needed to happen to those documents. He said Dix had asked about the woman specifically, and Silas had said, use your judgment, which was a phrase Marsh said he understood to mean that the woman's survival was not a priority. Use your judgment, the prosecutor repeated. Yes, Marsh said. Those were the words. Corbett cross-examined Marsh for an hour, working on his credibility, his motivation for testifying, the possibility that he'd misheard or misremembered. Marsh held up with the stubbornness of someone who has decided the truth is the only safe ground left to stand on and is going to stand on it. Dix himself was not in the courtroom. He had not been located by the sheriff's office, which Denton acknowledged with the professional dissatisfaction of someone who considers an unfound man a personal failing. This absence was something Silas's attorneys tried to use no corroboration, they argued, of Marsh's account. Hatch argued back that absence was not exculpation, and that the jury was entitled to draw its own conclusions about why a man who could have testified to the facts of the situation had instead chosen to be elsewhere. The jury appeared to share that view. Fletcher Oakes testified about the 1882 Hargrove boundary dispute and Silas's involvement in it, establishing the pattern of behavior that stretched back further than anyone in the county had previously understood. His testimony was slow and careful and specific in the way of a man who has had 11 years to think about something and now understands it fully. The Garrity brothers submitted their account records as documentary evidence rather than testifying directly, which their attorney arranged through proper channels, and the documents did the speaking that didn't require a human voice. Calhoun testified last among the ranchers, and he was the oldest person in the witness stand and possibly the most effective because he spoke without the careful architecture of someone presenting a legal argument. He spoke the way old men sometimes speak in moments that matter, which is directly and without decoration. "I've watched this territory change," he said. "I've watched men come in and try to own what they had no right to. Some of them used guns, Silas Crow used paper, but the intention was the same: to take what belongs to someone else by making them afraid or confused or outnumbered." He looked at the jury, not at the attorneys, not at the judge. The woman who came here as a bride, she wasn't afraid and she wasn't confused. That's what he didn't plan for. Corbett objected that this was opinion, not testimony. The judge sustained it and instructed the jury to disregard the characterization. But the jury had heard it, and some things once said in a room stay in the room regardless of what the judge says about them. The jury took 2 days. Wade had been warned by Hatch that 2 days was not unusual and not necessarily a bad sign. The juries took time on complex fraud cases because the financial documentation required discussion, that it didn't mean they were uncertain about the fundamental question. Knowing this intellectually and sitting with it in the boarding house, where they'd taken rooms for the trial, were different experiences. The 2 days had the specific quality of waiting that cannot be productive, where the mind keeps circling back to the thing it cannot yet know, and burning energy on the circling. Marlowe spent one of the days writing letters. She wrote to Mrs. Aldrich in Columbus, who had started all of this in her small way by checking on Daniel and noticing the man who'd come asking questions. She wrote to Agnes Purcell in Harlan, whose notarial seal on 12 pages of documentation had helped make this trial possible. She wrote, briefly and formally, to the prosecutor's office in Billings that was handling the investigation into Amos Farr's death separately from the fraud case, to let them know she was available and would testify in that proceeding when it came. She was writing the last of these when Daniel knocked on the door of her room and came in and sat on the edge of the bed, the way he'd sat on the edge of her bed since he was 6 years old, and wanted to talk about something he hadn't figured out yet. "What happens if the verdict goes wrong?" he said. "The civil case continues regardless," she said. "The fraud documentation goes to the territorial regulatory body regardless. The criminal referral stays with the prosecutor regardless." "That's not what I asked," he said. She set down her pen. "I know, I asked what happens to you." She was quiet for a moment. The window of the boarding house room looked out on Harlan's Main Street, ordinary Thursday afternoon, people going past on horses and on foot, with the unhurried purpose of people who live in a place and are not waiting for anything. "The same thing that was always going to happen," she said. "I go back to the ranch, I file the deed properly and permanently. I continue to exist in this territory, which Silas Crow would like me not to do." She paused. "A wrong verdict doesn't change any of that. It just means he pays less of a price than he should." Daniel looked at his hands. He was still thin from the weeks in the South County boarding house, though he'd filled out some over the spring. He'd been working with Pepper since March and had developed competence with horses faster than anyone had expected, which had become a point of quiet pride he tried not to make obvious and mostly failed at. "I should have come with you," he said, in December. "You couldn't have known I should have come anyway." He looked at her. "You shouldn't have been on that coach alone, Daniel." She waited until he met her eyes. "Nothing that happened was because I was alone. It happened because Silas Crow decided my life was an inconvenience to him. That's not about me being alone. That's about him being who he is." She paused. "And if you'd been on that coach, we'd both have been in the snow." He was quiet for a moment. "Or we'd both have fought back." She looked at him. And then, unexpectedly, she smiled a full one. Nothing withheld. "Probably," she said. "Probably that." The verdict came on a Friday afternoon. Guilty on 7 of 9 counts. The 2 counts that didn't hold were both minor procedural fraud charges that Hatch had included as supporting documentation rather than primary claims, and their exclusion changed nothing about the weight of what remained. Conspiracy to commit robbery, fraud, criminal abuse of fiduciary responsibility, theft of livestock, conspiracy and the planning of a violent crime. Silas heard the verdict read in the same posture he'd maintained throughout the trial, straight, controlled, the face of a man who will not give a room the satisfaction of his expression. But his hands on the table in front of him were not the same as his face. Wade noticed this from across the room. The hands gave something away that the face didn't. Sentencing was set for 4 weeks out. Hatch told them afterward in the corridor that, based on the weight of conviction, he expected significant time, that the judge had a reputation for treating financial crimes of this scale with the seriousness they deserved, which was something she'd said explicitly in previous cases. Corbett announced immediately that there would be an appeal. Hatch said that was Corbett's right, and that the documentation was thorough enough to survive it. Outside the courthouse in the June afternoon, the group of them stood on the steps, Marlowe and Daniel and Wade and the Garrittys and Oakes, who had ridden in for the verdict and who stood now in the early summer air with the look of men who have finished something long and heavy and are not quite sure yet how to hold the new lightness. Cal Garrity said, "Well," nobody added to that for a moment. Then Emmett said, "Dinner's on Oakes," and the tension broke in the practical way that frontier tensions often do, into laughter and argument about where and who was paying for what, and they moved off the steps and into the ordinary afternoon. Marlowe stayed on the steps for a moment, and Wade stayed with her. "Amos Farr," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "It's not the same proceeding. His case is separate. This doesn't." "I know," he said again. "But Marsh's testimony goes to that proceeding, and Denton is still looking for Dix." He paused. "It's not finished, but it's further than it was." She nodded. That was true. Further than it was real, even when it wasn't everything. The summer moved the way Montana summers do when you let yourself feel them fast. Luminous, so different from the winter that preceded it that it can seem like a different country. The upper pasture came back green. The cattle moved north again. The creek in the boundary gap ran clear and steady, and the 40 acres of Marlowe's father's land, properly deeded and recorded at the Harlan Land Office under her name, and then, after a morning in August that involved paperwork and 2 witnesses, and Agnes Purcell's seal for the 3rd time, under both their names, became part of something that held together in a way the separate pieces never had. The Territorial Land and Resource Company's Northern County claims were formally withdrawn as part of the legal resolution, which meant the land Silas had been positioning around neighboring properties reverted to open status and was reclaimable by those who had prior interests. Oakes filed on 2 parcels immediately, the Garrittys on 1. Calhoun, who moved slowly by temperament and principle, said he'd think about it, which meant he'd file in the fall. Silas was sentenced in July to 9 years in the Territorial Penitentiary. His attorneys filed the appeal the same day. Patch said the documentation would hold. Wade took this on faith, because at some point you have to take something on faith, and he had run out of other things to do with the outcome. Dix was located in August, in a mining camp south of the territory, by a deputy who had followed a name through 3 counties and a winter's worth of patience. He was brought back to face separate charges related to Red Rock Pass, and Marlowe testified at that proceeding as in September. And she was steady on the stand in the way she'd been steady throughout, which was not the steadiness of someone who feels nothing, but the steadiness of someone who has decided that feeling it is their own business, and the room doesn't get to have it. What the room got instead was the facts. Amos Farr's name again, set into the record with the same deliberateness she'd used the first time. Daniel stayed. This had not been the plan and had not been formally decided. It had just accreted over the months the way some things do, 1 week becoming 2, the spring work being more than Pepper could manage alone. The discovery that Daniel had a specific talent for the mechanical aspects of ranch maintenance that nobody had predicted, including Daniel. By July, he had taken on the repair and upkeep of the equipment as something close to a full role, and by August Pepper had stopped referring to him as the sister's brother and started referring to him as just Daniel, which on the Callahan ranch was a kind of citizenship. He and Elsie had developed a relationship that involved a significant amount of mutual instruction. He taught her things she wasn't supposed to know about the internal workings of wagon axles, and she taught him things from the books she was working through with the authority of a child who has decided she is a teacher and is not going to let uncertainty about her qualifications get in the way. It was by most measures an equal exchange, Mrs. Holt announced in September that she would be going to her daughter's family in Billings for the winter, which she'd been wanting to do for 2 years. And that she felt comfortable leaving the household in capable hands. She said this looking at Marlowe, who received it as the acknowledgement it was intended to be, and said she'd write. It was Elsie who said it first, which was how Elsie handled most of the significant things in her life, directly, without preamble, from the middle of something else. She was at the kitchen table with a book, and Marlowe was across from her going through correspondence, and Elsie looked up and said, "Can I call you Mama?" The kitchen was very quiet. Marlowe set down the letter she was holding. She looked at Elsie with the full attention she always gave her, not the managing attention of an adult dealing with a child, the real kind. "Where did that come from?" she asked. Elsie considered. "Lucy Oakes calls her stepmother Mama," she said, "because she chose her. She said you can choose who gets to be your mama." She paused. "I want to choose." Marlowe was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough for Elsie to look slightly uncertain, which for Elsie was a rare state. "Yes," Marlowe said, "you can." Elsie looked back at her book. "Okay," she said, with the satisfaction of someone who has settled a matter and is ready to move on to the next thing. She turned a page. Marlowe picked up her letter. Her hands were not entirely steady. She put them flat on the table for a moment before she continued reading, and Elsie didn't look up, and the kitchen held them both in its ordinary way, which was the only way it knew how to hold people, and which turned out to be enough. Wade asked her in October, which was not when he'd planned to ask her, because he hadn't exactly planned. He'd been thinking about it for months, working out what to say, when to say it, how to frame a question that deserved to be framed carefully given everything that surrounded it. He had 3 or 4 versions of the conversation in his head, none of which satisfied him. What actually happened was that they were walking the north fence line in the late afternoon, checking the repair work Daniel had done on a section that had taken some weather damage, and the mountains were doing what they do in October, which is turn every color at once in the last of the light, and Marlowe was ahead of him slightly, pointing out a section of wire that needed one more staple, and he said, "Marlowe." She turned. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know before I ask it that the answer doesn't change anything about the situation. You and Daniel are here and welcome here regardless. That's not contingent." She looked at him steadily. "All right, I want to know if you'd marry me," he said. "Not because of the land or the arrangement or anything that started this. Because of—" He stopped. He wasn't a man who made speeches, and he'd known that about himself going in, which was part of why the prepared versions had felt wrong. "Because of what it actually is," he said. "What it turned into." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you think it is?" she said. He thought about it honestly. "Something I'd rather not be without," he said, "which is the most accurate way I know to say it." Marlowe looked at him with that checking expression she had, the one that by now he knew well enough to read not doubt, verification. Making sure the thing is what it appears to be before she commits to it. "I wrote you 4 drafts of the first letter," she said. "I know, you told me. I didn't tell you what they said. The ones I didn't send." She looked at the mountains. "The first 3 were careful, presented the best version of the situation. My abilities, my willingness to work, my understanding of frontier life." She paused. "The 4th one said I was tired of being careful, that I'd spent 2 years being careful, and I was 27 years old, and I wanted one honest thing." She paused again. "That's the one I sent you." He waited. "So yes," she said, "I'll marry you, because I think you're an honest thing." She turned back to the fence section. "But that wire still needs a staple." He looked at the wire. He looked at her. "I'll get the staple," he said. They married in November, which was practical because the ranch work slowed in November, and impractical because November in Montana has weather opinions that don't consult anyone's plans. The ceremony was Small Oaks and his sons, the Garrity brothers, Calhoun, Denton, and his wife, Agnes Purcell, who had been invited because Marlowe felt she deserved to see the outcome of the notarial work, and Daniel, who stood next to Marlowe with the expression of a young man working very hard to maintain composure and not entirely succeeding. Pepper was there. He stood at the back with his hat in his hands and the expression of someone who had watched a thing develop from its earliest troubled stages and was quietly satisfied with where it had ended up, which was not where anyone had expected, but which, on reflection, made sense. Elsie wore a dress that Mrs. Holt had made before she left for Billings, white with blue at the collar, and held a handful of dried wildflowers that she'd collected and stored since summer specifically for this occasion, because she had known this occasion was coming before anyone had officially announced it, because she was Elsie. She stood beside Marlowe during the ceremony and held her hand without being asked, and Marlowe held hers back. It was not a smooth ceremony. The officiant lost his place twice. Daniel knocked over a chair at a critical moment and spent 30 seconds in mortified silence while everyone waited for the noise to settle. The wind came up outside and found the gap under the front door that Wade had been meaning to fix since September and sent a draft through the room that made the candles work for their light. None of it was the way such things look when they're described later, after time has smoothed the particular edges of events into something more manageable. It was what it was, which was real and imperfect and happening to actual people in an actual house, on an actual piece of Montana ground that had been fought for and documented and defended, and was now, finally, fully theirs. There are things you can plan and things you can't, and most people spend the better part of their lives confusing the two. Marlowe Bennett had planned to come west and begin again. She had planned to arrive in December and meet the man she'd been exchanging letters with and build something practical and workable and honest. She had not planned to end up in a snowdrift with a bullet wound. She had not planned to spend 2 months rebuilding a case against a man who'd decided she was an acceptable casualty. She had not planned to fall in love with a rancher who expressed his feelings by getting staples for fence wire. Life on the frontier in 9887 was not a life that rewarded the people who needed everything to go as planned. It rewarded the people who could assess the actual situation, not the situation they'd prepared for, not the situation they'd deserved, the actual one, and decide what to do next. The people who survived and built something worth having were not the ones who were toughest or best positioned or luckiest. though all of those things helped. They were the ones who kept thinking when it would have been easier to stop. Marlowe was that kind of person. She'd been that kind of person before Montana, and Montana had confirmed it at considerable cost. What this country does to people who are underestimated, who are passed over and dismissed and decided about before they've had the chance to be known, is one of two things. It breaks them or it reveals them. The breaking is quieter and more common and goes largely unrecorded. The revealing is rarer, and looks from the outside like luck or strength, and from the inside feels mostly like one more decision made under pressure, by a person who is not sure they have enough left and turns out to have enough. Marlowe thought about this sometimes, in the particular way that people who have been through difficult things think about them afterward, not constantly, not with drama, but in the way an old healed wound sometimes makes itself known on cold mornings. Not pain, just presence, a reminder that it happened and that they're still here. She thought about the driver of the coach, Amos Farr, and about the fact that he'd been survived by a wife and 2 children in Billings, and about the fact that justice was slow and imperfect, and arrived at angles you didn't predict, and that slow and imperfect, and at an angle was still better than not at all. Dix had been convicted in December, sentenced to 7 years. Silas's appeal had been denied in the spring following, his sentence confirmed, and the Territorial Land and Resource Company formally dissolved by order of the court. The northern county breathed differently after that. Not dramatically, not all at once. But the land claims around neighboring properties had gone quiet. The survey crews stopped appearing at fence lines. The particular kind of pressure that you don't fully register until it lifts that ambient weight of knowing someone powerful is building something in your direction was gone. Oakes said once in passing that the county felt more like itself again. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Spring came as it always does, with its grudging optimism and its disregard for whatever winter thought it had established. The creek ran high with snowmelt. The cattle moved north to the upper pasture. Daniel fixed the gap under the front door that Wade had been meaning to fix since September, and did it correctly, which Wade acknowledged with a nod that contained approximately everything he wasn't going to say out loud. Elsie turned 6 in April and received a book from Marlowe and a new knife from Daniel, which caused a brief household conversation about appropriate gifts for 6-year-olds, and resulted in an arrangement where the knife was kept in a specific drawer and only taken out with supervision, which Elsie agreed to with the diplomatic grace of someone who has the item in question and can afford to be reasonable about the conditions. On a morning in May, Marlowe walked the full perimeter of the combined property, the Callahan land, and her father's 40 acres merged into one, the boundary lines drawn and documented and registered, and no longer a gap that anyone could exploit. She walked it alone, which she'd done a few times since the documents were finalized, not because she needed to, but because there was something in the physical act of it that mattered to her in a way she didn't try to articulate. Her father had never seen this land. He'd acquired it through a transaction he'd probably done half his attention to, one piece of a business portfolio that had mostly gone to debt. He'd left it to her because she was the oldest, and because she was the one who understood documents, and because she suspected he'd known on some level that she was going to need it. He'd been a man who worried about her in the specific way of people who love someone and recognize something in them that the world won't always accommodate easily. She walked the north fence line to the point where it met the creek and stood there for a while. The water was quick and cold and clear, coming down from the snowpack, doing what water does, finding its level, following the ground, indifferent to everything except where the land takes it. She thought, I am here, and the people I love are here, and the man who tried to make sure I wasn't here is in a penitentiary, and the land my father left me is part of something that will outlast all of us. She thought, that is not everything. It is also not nothing. She turned and walked back toward the house. Wade was at the fence by the barn, looking at her from a distance with the particular quality of attention that people give to something they are glad to see and do not take for granted. He didn't wave. She didn't either. They just looked at each other across the spring yard of a ranch that had been through enough to know what it was worth, and then she walked the rest of the way home. The mountains were white at their tops and green below that, and the sky was the color that Montana sky is on good days, which is a color that doesn't have a name that quite covers it, and the creek ran through the merged boundary of the north pasture with the sound that moving water makes, which is not silence and not quite speech, but something that has always been mistaken for both.